Did you ever stop to think about how different the world of superhero gaming would be if the caped crusader had spent his nights following a rhythm instead of a path of vengeance? It sounds like a total fever dream, but the legendary Batman Arkham series, which is widely considered the gold standard for putting you right inside the boots of Gotham's Dark Knight, actually had its humble beginnings as a rhythm-based action game. It is a piece of gaming history that feels almost impossible to believe given how gritty and visceral the final product became, but the original vision from the team at Rocksteady was something far closer to a musical experience. Imagine, if you will, the studio behind this massive success originally sitting down to plan out something that could essentially be described as Guitar Hero, but with a heavy dose of bats and batarangs. In those very early stages of development, the team was experimenting with a system where the free-flowing, bone-crunching combat we love today was swapped out for a rhythmic sequence of button presses that had to be timed perfectly with a musical beat. There were actually early versions of the game that took this concept even further, flipping the entire perspective into a flat 2D plane. In these builds, the player wasn't navigating a 3D asylum at all. Instead, you were watching colored circles drift across the screen, waiting for them to collide so you could hit the corresponding button at exactly the right millisecond. It was basically Dance Dance Revolution, but instead of neon mats and pop songs, you were wearing a high-tech batsuit and trying to take down thugs in a gloomy hallway. The core philosophy behind this was actually quite poetic in its own way. The developers felt that Batman's fighting style shouldn't just be about mindless violence. It should feel like a symphony of motion. They wanted every punch thrown, every counterattack executed, and every graceful dodge to feel as though it were synced up to a drum beat, creating a flow that was as much about timing as it was about power. However, as fascinating as that idea looked when it was scribbled down on paper, it quickly became clear that it had a massive problem. The concept absolutely clashed with the dark, heavy, and immersive atmosphere that Rocksteady was trying to build for Gotham City. When you think of Batman, you think of a shadow-dwelling detective who strikes fear into the hearts of criminals, not a hero who looks like he's hitting sick dance moves in response to bright on-screen prompts. Seeing the Dark Knight perform what looked like a choreographed routine just didn't feel Gotham-like enough. It broke the tension and made the Caped Crusader feel less like a force of nature and more like a performer. Because of this, the strict rhythm system was eventually tossed aside. But if you look closely at the finished game, you have to ask yourself, did that rhythmic heart ever truly stop beating? According to Sefton Hill, the lead designer who helped steer the ship at Rocksteady, that original idea never really vanished. He has gone on record saying that he always wanted Batman's combat to feel like a dance of sorts, even if the musical prompts were removed. The developers managed to take the skeleton of that early rhythm prototype and build the final world-renowned free-flow combat system right on top of it. This is why the combat in the Arkham series feels so much more satisfying than almost any other brawler out there. Your combos only stay alive if you have a sense of timing. Your counters aren't just about quick reflexes. They require you to anticipate the natural beat of the fight. Once you've managed to string together 30 or 40 flawless hits, you suddenly realize that you aren't just smashing buttons in a panic. You are part of a rhythmic flow, moving from one enemy to the next, with a grace that echoes those early musical experiments. This system was so revolutionary that its influence can still be seen today in massive titles like the Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor games, or even the modern entries in the Assassin's Creed franchise. It's wild to realize that the entire landscape of modern action games might look completely different if Rocksteady hadn't decided to strip the music away from their rhythmic bat prototype. But the differences between the Arkham games and other versions of the Batman story don't just stop at how the fighting works. One of the most glaring and interesting departures in this universe is the complete lack of a traditional romance between Batman and Catwoman. If you look at almost any other piece of media, the classic comic books, the legendary animated shows, or the big-budget Hollywood movies, Selina Kyle is rarely just another face in the rogues gallery. She is almost always the primary love interest, the one person who truly knows how to get under Bruce Wayne's skin and, on occasion, under his very expensive cape. In those stories, their relationship is a constant will they, won't they dynamic that adds a layer of human vulnerability to the Dark Knight. In the Arkhamverse, however, our Batman seems to be the unluckiest version of the character when it comes to matters of the heart. You have to wonder who in their right mind would want to miss out on that kind of connection, but Rocksteady decided to take a different path. While the banter is definitely present and the flirting is as sharp as a batarang, the tension never truly takes center stage. You see glimpses of their history, especially in the later chapters of Arkham Knight, where their chemistry is fleshed out a bit more, but they are never allowed to be a proper couple. They are two lonely souls destined to walk separate paths, and even though they share a final, lingering kiss at the end of the journey, it's more of a goodbye than a beginning. It's a bit of a tragic take on the duo, especially since many fans were rooting for Bruce to finally find a bit of happiness. If most of us were in Batman's shoes, we definitely wouldn't let go of Selina Kyle that easily. But the Arkham Batman is a man completely consumed by his mission, leaving very little room for anyone else. Speaking of legendary relationships, we have to talk about the rivalry that defines this entire series, the battle between Batman and his arch-nemesis, the Joker. While Catwoman might be the missed love interest, some fans jokingly argue that the Joker is the Dark Knight's true lover in this universe, given how obsessed they are with one another. But we almost lost the most iconic part of that rivalry when the legendary Mark Hamill nearly walked away from the role. For many of us, Hamill is the only true voice of the Clown Prince of Crime. He had been voicing the character since the early 1990s, but by the time the series reached its second entry, Arkham City, the role was starting to take a massive toll on him. Voicing the Joker isn't just about talking. It's about those shrieking laughs, the manic screams, and the constant vocal gymnastics that were absolutely wrecking Hamill's vocal cords. In fact, after Arkham City was finished, Hamill was ready to hang up the purple suit for good. He even referred to that game as his final song, a fitting end to a long and storied career as the world's most dangerous clown. So, when the team at Rocksteady began the massive undertaking of creating the final chapter, Arkham Knight, they found themselves in a difficult position. The Joker was a vital part of the story they wanted to tell, but the man who brought him to life wasn't sitting in the recording booth. However, a single factor changed everything. Mark Hamill didn't come back for the money, and he didn't come back just because he loved the character. He came back because of the Batman himself, or rather, the voice behind the mask. The late, great Kevin Conroy, whose passing left a massive hole in the hearts of fans everywhere, had signed on to reprise his role as the Dark Knight for the final game. Hamill has stated multiple times throughout his career that his performance as the Joker is inextricably linked to Conroy's Batman. He famously said that he simply wouldn't play the Joker unless Kevin Conroy was there to be his Batman. It's a deeply poetic sentiment that reminds us that Gotham's greatest rivalry only truly works when both sides show up to play their part. Because Conroy was on board, Hamill decided to push through the vocal strain one last time, and thank goodness he did. Without him, the Joker in Arkham Knight simply wouldn't have been the same. The version of the Joker we got in that final game is easily one of the most creative uses of a villain in gaming history. Even though the character was technically killed off at the end of the previous game, Rocksteady decided to place him directly inside Batman's brain as a haunting manifestation of the fear toxin. This allowed Hamill to give his most extra performance yet. Since he was a hallucination, he didn't have to follow the rules of reality. He spent the entire game performing a twisted version of stand-up comedy inside Bruce's head, mocking his failures, singing dark little songs, and even photobombing your camera during your quiet moments of gliding over the city. It was a brilliant way to keep the rivalry alive even after death, and it's a performance that almost never existed. We are so lucky that we got to see this final mental version of the Joker, because there were other versions of the character that were planned early on that we definitely would not have wanted to meet in a dark alley. During the very early conceptual stages of the first game, Arkham Asylum, The team was experimenting with a completely different look for the final boss fight involving the Joker and the Titan formula. A concept artist named Carlos Danda was cooking up some true nightmare fuel for players. His original designs for a Titan Joker weren't just muscular, they were grotesque and inhuman. He envisioned a creature that was disjointed and spider-like, with elongated limbs, twisted joints, and a face that looked like it had crawled out of a horrifying internet urban legend or a secret government monster file. It was a design that looked like a terrifying hybrid between the Joker and the creature from the Alien movies. While some fans of horror might have loved to see that level of deformity, it would have been a very different experience to actually play against it. Ultimately, the developers decided to rein it in. They felt that the Joker's final form should still feel human at its core. They wanted it to be clearly recognizable as the Joker, just amplified and distorted by the chemical formula. By choosing a more muscular, hulking version of the Titan Joker, the team felt they were preserving a bit of the character's humanity, or at least his recognizable silhouette. It's a decision that kept us away from the jittery, spider-like freak that could have been, although interestingly enough, some of those early nightmare concepts seem to be finding new life recently. Some fans have pointed out that the recently revealed Absolute Joker designs in the comics share a certain spiritual energy with those old, discarded monster sketches. But the Joker wasn't the only villain who went through a major transformation during the development of the first game. In the early planning stages for the Asylum, the Mad Hatter was actually supposed to be a significant part of the experience. For those who might not be deep into the lore, Jervis Tetch is one of Batman's creepiest foes. He is a man obsessed with the world of Alice in Wonderland, but he uses high-tech mind control devices hidden inside hats to hypnotize his victims and drag them into his delusions. He's basically a much more dangerous and unstable version of those Disney adults you might see in real life, someone who has completely lost touch with reality in favor of a fairy tale. Rocksteady actually had elaborate plans for the Hatter to appear in the first game, including an entire level designed around a children's hedge maze. You can only imagine how trippy and unsettling that would have been. Batman navigating a distorted Wonderland nightmare while a rhyming madman whispers threats into his ear from the shadows. Ultimately, the level was cut because the developers felt it didn't quite fit the pacing of the story they were telling. They didn't want to just throw villains in for the sake of having them. They wanted everyone to serve the narrative. However, they didn't want to erase him entirely, so they left a small nod to his presence in the form of a Riddler challenge located in the Botanical Gardens. Another enemy type that almost made the cut was the Straitjacket Henchman. This wasn't supposed to be a famous villain, but rather a terrifying new kind of grunt that you would have to fight. Imagine a prisoner from the deepest parts of the asylum, still strapped into a heavy canvas straitjacket, thrashing around wildly and somehow swinging a blunt weapon at you with desperate strength. It's a haunting image, and you have to wonder what kind of dark writing sessions led to the creation of such a character. While these enemies never appeared as living opponents, their presence is still felt in the game if you know where to look. If you spend some time snooping around the medical facility, you can actually find a severed head of one of these inmates preserved in a jar. It's a gruesome little detail that the developers clearly liked because they brought it back for the sequel. In the steel mill in the second game, you can find the same pickled head sitting in a corridor, a silent reminder of a character that almost was. In the world of the Arkham games, the fans are just as dedicated as the developers, and this has led to a massive amount of speculation about which big-name villains were almost included. Names like Mr. Freeze, Clayface, or even obscure characters like Killer Moth are often brought up in theories about cut content. While many of these are just fun fan stories with no official confirmation from the studio or the internal game files, there is a reason why people love to guess. Rocksteady was famous for laying down breadcrumbs all over their games, and the fans were more than happy to eat them up. Take the character of Maxi Zeus, for example. He's a villain who genuinely believes he is the reincarnation of the Greek god Zeus, and He runs his criminal empire like a twisted version of Mount Olympus. While he never appears in person, the signs of his influence are absolutely everywhere if you look closely. In the first game, tucked away in the intensive treatment ward, there is a cell covered in Greek symbols and ancient mythology books. It's a glaring calling card for a man with a god complex. The developers continued this trend in the sequel, slipping in even more references. You can find nods to a nightclub called the Gotham Olympus, which is exactly the kind of place a self-proclaimed god would run. There's even a riddle you can solve by scanning a lightning bolt statue that gives you a bit more lore about his background. This was the beauty of the Arkham series. It felt like a living, breathing world where every villain was just around the corner, even if they weren't in the main spotlight yet. Rocksteady was planting seeds from the very first day, and one of the best examples of this long-term planning involves Ra's al Ghul. In the morgue of the first game, you can find a body bag with his name on it. It's creepy enough on its own, but if you leave the room and come back later, the body has simply vanished. This wasn't a technical glitch. It was a deliberate wink to the character's immortality and his use of the Lazarus pits. Even though he didn't make his full appearance until the second game, the studio wanted you to know he was already part of the world. Killer Croc received similar treatment in the final game of the trilogy. While he was a terrifying boss in the first game, he seemed to be missing for most of the finale. However, the world was filled with environmental clues, newspaper clippings, and hidden files that reminded the player he was still lurking in the sewers of Gotham, waiting for his moment to strike. When his dedicated story content finally arrived later as part of a seasonal update, he was bigger and scarier than ever, proving that the developers never truly forgot a character once they introduced them. Then there's Warren White, also known as the Great White Shark. In the comics, he's a white-collar criminal who gets sent to the asylum and ends up being mutilated until he looks like a literal shark. While he never steps into the light in the games, you can find a cell covered in shark teeth and legal documents pointing to his existence. In the sequel, there's even a building marked with his initials. It's these kinds of tiny, creepy details hiding in plain sight that made the Arkham world feel so much denser than your average superhero game. Even characters who never appeared at all, like the ventriloquist, left their mark. While Arnold Wesker is nowhere to be found, his infamous puppet, Scarface, is basically on a world tour of the series. You can find that deranged little wooden mobster locked in a glass display case in the first game, where the Joker actually plays with him for a moment before the final confrontation. In the sequel, the puppet shows up again in the steel mill, looking a bit abandoned. By the time the third game rolled around, Scarface was still making cameos during the Riddler's various missions. It's a testament to the love the developers had for the source material that they would include a character like Scarface in every single game without ever actually showing the man who pulls the strings. Even the investigative journalist Jack Ryder serves as a bridge to another obscure character. If you dig through the audio recordings scattered throughout the games, you'll find references to Ryder's wild alter ego, the Creeper. While he never actually puts on the flashy costume and goes out into the night as a vigilante in the Arkham universe, the implication is clearly there for the fans to find. It's this level of world building that kept the community on the edge of their seats, always hunting for the next clue about who might be lurking in the shadows of the next alleyway. Rocksteady didn't just build a game, they built a museum of Batman history, and every single room had a story to tell if you were willing to look for it. While we are exploring the deep layers of how Rocksteady built this world, we have to look at one of the most chilling and subtle psychological tricks they pulled in the first game. There is a specific location in Arkham Asylum known as the Visitor Center, and it serves as the backdrop for one of the most effective creature-in-the-room gags in gaming history. When you first enter this area, you might notice a seemingly harmless Joker mannequin sitting in a chair with a television for a head. At first glance, just looks like a piece of eccentric set dressing, the kind of weird thing the Joker would leave behind to mock Batman. However, the longer you stay in that room, the more you start to feel like something is fundamentally wrong. If you look away from the figure and then quickly look back, you might notice that its arms have shifted. Its posture changes ever so slightly when it isn't in your direct line of sight. As you progress through the story and find yourself returning to the visitor center later on, the situation escalates. Suddenly, there aren't just one or two mannequins. There are several, and they seem to be inching closer to the center of the room every time you blink. It is reminiscent of those spooky garden gnomes or the weeping statues from other horror media, a presence that moves on when you aren't watching. To make this even more effective, Rocksteady intentionally disabled the detective vision in this specific area. Normally, you rely on that vision as a bit of a safety net, an electronic eye that lets you see the heat signatures of living beings, so you can tell what is a threat and what is just a prop. By taking that away, the developers forced you to rely on your own eyes, making the uncertainty even heavier. There has long been a theory among the community that this wasn't just a random haunting, but was actually where the Joker was hiding in plain sight throughout the entire night, watching Batman struggle before his final reveal. This kind of attention to psychological detail is what made the world feel alive. Even when you weren't actively fighting a villain, you felt like they were standing right behind you, waiting for their turn to strike. This philosophy of rewarding the player for paying close attention extends into the characters that didn't get much screen time in the main story, but were still deeply integrated into the world's history. Take Julian Day, better known as the Calendar Man. In the first game, he is nothing more than a ghost, a name on a cell wall covered in frantic scribbles of dates and holidays. You never actually see the man in the flesh during your first trip through the asylum, but the evidence of his madness is everywhere. It wasn't until the second game, Arkham City, that the developers finally gave us the man to match the calendar. In the basement of the courthouse, you can find him locked away in a glass cell, but he isn't just a static NPC with a few lines of dialogue. Rocksteady built an incredibly elaborate secret into his character that required players to visit him on actual, real-world holidays. If you took the time to boot up the game on Christmas, Halloween, or even obscure dates like St. Patrick's Day, Julian would have entirely unique voice lines describing a specific crime he committed on that day. This was a massive undertaking for the sound and writing teams, as it required a huge amount of hidden voice work that most players might never even hear. It turned the character into a living chronicle of the game's timeline. There was even a final, legendary secret hidden in his calendar that wasn't discovered for years. If you visited him on a specific date related to the founding of Rocksteady Studios itself, he would give a cryptic speech about the beginning and the end, a bit of meta-commentary that showed just how far the developers were willing to go to hide secrets for the most dedicated fans. This level of foreshadowing was a staple of the series. If you were exploring the penitentiary in the first game, you might have stumbled across a very specific dark mask sitting on a desk. For the casual fan, it was just a cool-looking prop, but for comic readers, it was an immediate sign that Roman Sionis, the ruthless Black Mask, was part of this world's history. He wouldn't show up in a major way until the prequel game, but his presence was felt from the very start. Similarly, in the medical facility of the asylum, there is a staff board listing the names of various doctors. If you scan that board, you'll find the name Thomas Elliot. To most, it was just a name, but to those who knew the stories, it was a chilling hint at the character Hullitcher, Hush, Bruce Wayne's childhood friend who would eventually go on to carve a new face for himself to destroy Batman. Rocksteady was planting these seeds years before they ever grew into full missions, creating a sense of continuity that felt earned rather than forced. One of the deepest cuts in the Asylum's environmental storytelling can be found in a patient interview tape for Poison Ivy. During the recording, she mentions a scientist named Jason Woodrue. For the hardcore DC fans, that name sends a shiver down the spine. Woodrue is the Floronic Man, a bizarre half-plant, half-human creature who was responsible for the experiment that turned Pamela Eiley into Poison Ivy in the first place. By including these names in the audio files and background textures, the developers were acknowledging the vast interconnected nature of the DC universe. They weren't just making a game about one man in an asylum, They were building a bridge to every story ever told about Gotham City. However, no villain utilized the power of the game's mechanics better than the Scarecrow. Dr. Jonathan Crane's segments in the first game are often cited as some of the most creative moments in all of gaming history. He wasn't a physical threat like Bane or a master of weapons. He was a master of the mind. When Batman is first hit by the fear toxin, the game doesn't just show you a cinematic of him being scared. Instead, the very world you are walking through begins to unravel. Walls peel away to reveal the night Bruce Wayne's parents were killed, and the hallways of the asylum transform into the rainy streets of Crime Alley. You are forced to relive the trauma of the protagonist, making the connection between the player and the character feel incredibly personal. The third and final Scarecrow segment is perhaps the most legendary of them all. As you are walking down a standard corridor, the screen suddenly begins to glitch out. For anyone playing back in 2009, this was a moment of pure panic. The image would tear, the sound would stutter into a loop, and the screen would go black, exactly like a hardware failure or a console crash. Thousands of players across the world reportedly jumped up to check their cables or yell at their television sets, thinking their expensive consoles had finally given up. This was a brilliant meta prank played by the developers to make you feel exactly what Batman was feeling, a complete loss of control. The story behind this moment is just as interesting as the moment itself. Creative director Sefton Hill actually had to seek special permission from Sony and Microsoft to include this sequence. Both companies were incredibly hesitant at first because faking a system crash is usually a massive red flag for customer support. They were worried that players would return their games or call in with complaints about broken hardware. But Hill was persistent, believing that this was the only way to truly convey the power of the fear toxin. When it finally worked, it became a defining moment for the series, a reminder that the game could reach out and touch you in the real world. It was a deconstruction of the medium itself, breaking the fourth wall in a way that felt terrifyingly earned. Rocksteady's mischievous streak didn't end with faking console crashes, though. They also built one of the funniest and most effective anti-piracy measures ever seen in a major PC release. If the game's internal checks detected that it was being played on a pirated version, it wouldn't just refuse to boot up. Instead, it would let you play for a while, but it would quietly disable one specific vital ability, the Cape Glide. Batman's ability to spread his wings and soar across gaps is the cornerstone of his mobility. In the pirated version, when you tried to glide, Batman would just flap his arms uselessly like a discount pigeon man and fall straight to the ground. This led to some hilarious interactions on online forums where people would post complaints about a glitch where Batman couldn't fly, only to be told by the developers themselves that the glitch was actually a moral failure on the player's part. Without the glide, you couldn't clear certain gaps or escape specific traps, making the game impossible to complete. It was a brilliant way to handle the situation. Instead of a boring error message, they turned the Dark Knight into a laughing stock for anyone who didn't buy the game properly. They even went further, quietly breaking other mechanics like grapple points or doors, effectively stripping away everything that made the character feel like a hero until you were just a man in a funny suit running around a hallway with no way out. This focus on the cape wasn't just for jokes or anti-piracy, though. The development of Batman's cape is a legendary story of obsession within the studio. It is said that one single developer, Ben Nicholson, who famously goes by the name Cape Guy online, spent nearly 2 entire years focusing almost exclusively on making that piece of fabric look and feel correct. When you consider that the cape has over 700 unique animations and its own set of physics rules, you start to realize why it took so long. It wasn't just a static piece of cloth, it had to react to the wind, the way Batman moved in combat, the way he crouched in the shadows, and how it unfurled when he jumped from a rooftop. It was treated as its own character, a menacing silhouette that defined the look of the Dark Knight. Without that level of dedication, the traversal in the game would have felt clunky and artificial. It's a perfect example of how the small details that we often take for granted are actually the things that ground the entire experience in reality. Despite the incredible polish of the final games, there were many ambitious ideas that had to be left on the cutting room floor. In the early days of Arkham Asylum, the team spent 4 months building a massive forensic system. They wanted to turn the game into a true CSI Gotham experience, where you would spend hours collecting fibers, analyzing blood splatter, and using various high-tech lab tools to piece together clues. On paper, it sounded like the ultimate detective simulator, but in practice, it killed the momentum of the game. Every time you found a new clue, the action would grind to a halt so you could play a minigame. The developers eventually realized that Batman needs to be a man of action as much as a man of science. So they streamlined the detective mode into the much faster, more intuitive system we see in the final version. They also experimented with a much more dynamic world in the first game. Early builds included weather systems like rain and thunder, but the technical limitations of the Unreal Engine 3 at the time made this difficult to pull off without sacrificing the frame rate. They didn't want the player's hardware to struggle just to show a few raindrops, so they opted for a static, moody atmosphere instead. Interestingly, when the games were eventually remastered for newer hardware using the Unreal Engine 4, those weather effects were finally added back in, fulfilling the original vision of a storm-soaked island. One of the most famous secrets in the history of the series involves a hidden room in the warden's office that wasn't discovered by players for over 6 months after the game launched. Rocksteady had tucked away a secret chamber behind a wall that didn't appear on any map and wouldn't react to your basic detective vision. To find it, you had to place explosive gel on a very specific, nondescript section of the wall and detonate it. Inside this room were the early plans and artistic sketches for the sequel, Arkham City. It was a massive reveal that showed the studio was already planning the future of the series before the first game was even on store shelves. The fact that thousands of players walked past that wall for half a year without ever knowing it was there is a testament to how well Rocksteady could hide information in plain sight. They eventually had to reveal the secret themselves because they were worried that no one would ever find it. As the series moved into its second chapter, the scale of these secrets only grew. Arkham City was a massive leap forward in terms of scope, but the developers were very careful about how they handled the open world aspect. They didn't want a sprawling, empty city like you might find in a typical sandbox game. Instead, they wanted the smallest, densest open world possible. Every single alleyway, every rooftop, and every sewer pipe had to have a purpose. You could feel the history of the city in the grime on the walls. One area would be dripping with the influence of the Penguin's mob, while another would be covered in the Joker's colorful, chaotic graffiti. It wasn't just a playground, it was a prison where the walls were closing in on you from every direction. This density allowed for some of the most memorable character moments in the series. One such moment involves the tragic villain, Mr. Freeze. After you complete his side mission and help him find his wife, Nora, you can actually follow a trail of ice that he leaves behind as he walks through the city. If you are patient and curious enough to track his path, you will find him in a quiet warehouse, simply sitting by his wife's side. There is no combat, no boss fight, and no mission prompt. It is just a quiet human moment between a man and the woman he loves. This kind of wordless storytelling is what separated the Arkham series from other superhero titles. It understood that these characters are more than just their powers or their masks. They are people with burdens and sorrows that the player can choose to witness if they take the time to look. The team also loved to play with the idea of the shadowy watcher. Throughout Arkham City, many players reported seeing a mysterious, white-clad figure standing on various rooftops, watching Batman from a distance. This was Azrael, a character who represents a dark prophecy for the future of Gotham. If you tracked him down multiple times and scanned the symbols he left behind, he would deliver a chilling message about the end of days and the fire that would eventually consume the city. This wasn't just flavor text, it was a direct setup for the events of the final game, Arkham Knight. It gave the series a sense of mythic weight, as if Batman wasn't just fighting criminals, but was struggling against a destiny that had already been written for him. Even the way the game handled its technical flourishes was tied to the idea of a living world. On the PC version of the games, if you had a high-end graphics card, you could enable enhanced physics that made the world feel incredibly tactile. Paper debris would fly through the air during explosions, banners would tear and sway in the breeze, and thick fog would react to Batman's movements as he glided through it. While these were mostly cosmetic, they added a layer of polish that made you feel the weight of every action. However, these features were also famously responsible for the disastrous launch of the final game on PC, where the sheer amount of particles and complex simulations caused the game to stutter and crash for thousands of users. It was a rare moment where the studio's ambition outpaced the available hardware, leading to the game being temporarily pulled from storefronts until it could be fixed. But despite those technical hurdles, the love for the world never wavered. Fans spent thousands of hours dissecting every frame of the trailers and every corner of the maps. They found nods to the 1960s Adam West show, like the hilarious shark-repellent death screen that appears if you are eaten by the giant shark in the museum. They found hidden messages from the Scarecrow hidden in the radio frequencies that could only be decrypted using a specific cipher. They even found references to other games and media, like a hidden lightsaber in a weapon locker that served as a tribute to Mark Hamill's other most famous role. The Arkham series was more than just a trilogy of games. It was a masterclass in how to treat a legendary character with respect while still pushing the boundaries of what a video game could be. It took the rhythmic heart of a simple action prototype and transformed it into a sprawling psychological epic that redefined an entire genre. Every secret found, every villain encountered, and every bone-crunching punch thrown was a part of a larger symphony, a dance of shadows that kept us coming back to the streets of Gotham again and again. Whether it was the obsessive detail of a swaying cape or the heart-pounding terror of a fake console crash, Rocksteady proved that they understood the Dark Knight better than almost anyone else in the industry. As we look deeper into the third and final installment, Arkham Knight, the level of detail only becomes more intense. The jump to the next generation of consoles allowed the team to realize a version of Gotham that was truly breathtaking. The Rain in this game is a character in itself. You can see every individual drop as it hits the matte surface of the Batsuit and rolls down the heavy armor plates. The city was expanded to 3 massive islands, each with its own distinct architectural style and atmosphere. This expansion was necessary because of the introduction of the Batmobile, a feature that fans had been demanding for years. However, adding a car to a game built around verticality and stealth wasn't as simple as just dropping a model into the world. The developers had to rethink the entire layout of the city to accommodate a high-speed tank. They widened the streets, added ramps to the rooftops, and built entire underground tunnel systems just to make sure the driving felt integrated into the experience. This decision was controversial for some, as the heavy focus on tank battles felt like a departure from the stealthy roots of the series, but it was an undeniable technical achievement. The Batmobile was essentially a mobile command center, a piece of high-tech machinery that felt like an extension of Batman's own will. You could eject from the cockpit at high speed, soaring into the air with enough momentum to glide across half the city, a move that felt incredibly empowering. But even with the new hardware and the massive city, Rocksteady stayed true to their love of hidden narrative threads. One of the most fascinating examples of this is the secret room found within the movie studios. If you explore the area where the Joker-infected patients are being held, you can find a hidden keypad. Entering a specific sequence, one that references the first appearance of Batman in the comics, opens a door to a room that serves as a tribute to the history of the character. It's filled with nods to past games and classic comic book covers, a quiet place for reflection in the middle of a city under siege. They also continued their tradition of using the environment to tell stories that the main plot didn't have time for. You could find the abandoned hideout of the serial killer Victor Zsasz, complete with his chilling tally marks on the walls. You could find evidence of the mob families that once ruled Gotham, now reduced to rubble by the escalating war between the supervillains. Every corner of the city felt like it had been lived in, fought over, and eventually abandoned. This sense of decay was central to the theme of the final game, a city that was finally breaking under the weight of its own sins. The narrative of the final game also took some massive risks, particularly with the return of the Joker as a mental projection. This allowed the writers to explore the internal struggle of Bruce Wayne in a way that hadn't been possible before. The Joker became the personification of Batman's greatest fear, that he would eventually lose his mind and become the very thing he fought against. This psychological battle was mirrored in the gameplay, as the Joker would often appear in the background of cutscenes or even replace standard enemies during hallucinations. It was a brilliant way to keep the series' most iconic villain relevant even after his physical death, ensuring that the rivalry between the two would only end when the story itself did. Rocksteady's journey from a small London studio with a rhythm game idea to the architects of the greatest superhero series in gaming history is a story of passion, obsession, and a deep understanding of what makes Batman special. They didn't just give us a hero to control, they gave us a world to inhabit. From the smallest hidden cipher to the grandest rooftop view, the Arkham series stands as a monument to the power of detail and the enduring legacy of the Dark Knight. As we continue to uncover the mysteries hidden within these games, we are reminded that in Gotham, nothing is ever quite what it seems, and the most important stories are often the ones told in the shadows. If we take a moment to look at the leap from the snowy, claustrophobic streets of Arkham City to the rain-slicked neon sprawl of Arkham Knight, it is easy to see that Rocksteady wasn't just making a bigger map. They were fundamentally rebuilding the way players interacted with Gotham. One of the most striking things about the transition to the final chapter was the sheer technical ambition involved in making the city feel like a seamless whole. The studio had moved from the previous generation of consoles to the power of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, and with that jump, they decided to tackle one of the most difficult challenges in game design: removing the barriers between the player and the world. In almost every other open-world game of that era, you would expect a loading screen when moving between the open city and a major indoor location. But for the finale of the trilogy, the team was obsessed with maintaining the flow. They wanted you to be able to glide through a window, land in a combat encounter, and then sprint back out to the street without ever seeing a progress bar. To achieve this, they had to push their heavily modified version of the Unreal Engine 3 to its absolute breaking point. They created a streaming system that was so fast it could load the high-resolution textures of a skyscraper while you were driving toward it at 100 miles per hour in a jet-powered tank. It was a massive undertaking that required every artist and programmer to rethink how they placed objects in the world. They had to hide the heavy lifting behind the geometry of the city itself, using tunnels, tight turns, and elevator rides to give the hardware just enough time to pull the next chunk of Gotham into memory. This brings us to the centerpiece of the entire experience, the one thing that changed everything: the Batmobile. It is impossible to talk about the final game without addressing the massive, hulking elephant in the room. Rocksteady knew that adding the car was the ultimate fan wish, but they also knew that simply giving Batman a fast car wouldn't be enough. It had to be the Batmobile, a force of nature that felt as unstoppable as the man driving it. The design they landed on was a brilliant, albeit polarizing, hybrid between a high-end sports car and a heavy artillery tank. This wasn't just a vehicle for getting from point A to point B. It was a character in its own right, possessing two distinct personalities that mirrored the duality of Batman himself. In pursuit mode, the car was all about speed and grace. The way the wheels would shift and the thrusters would ignite as you tore down Miyagani Island was a masterclass in kinetic satisfaction. But then there was battle mode, where the entire chassis would transform. The wheels would extend on hydraulic arms to allow for 360-degree strafing, and a massive 60mm cannon would emerge from the roof. This transformation was a technical marvel. The sound design alone, the grinding of metal, the hiss of the pistons, and the roar of the engine made the machine feel like a living, breathing beast. The team spent thousands of hours making sure that the transition between these two modes was instantaneous, allowing you to go from a high-speed chase to a tactical tank battle with a single trigger pull. However, this mechanical masterpiece came with a cost. To make the car feel useful, the developers had to design large portions of the game around it. This led to the tank battle sequences that some fans felt were overused. But from a design perspective, it was a fascinating experiment in escalating the stakes. You weren't just fighting thugs in an alley anymore, you were taking on an entire private army of drones. This shift changed the tone of the series, moving it away from the purely gothic horror of the first game and toward a high-stakes military thriller. Yet, even in the middle of these explosive battles, Rocksteady never lost sight of the details. If you look at the wheels of the car as you drive through a puddle, you can see the water splashing realistically against the tires. If you crash through a stone wall, the debris doesn't just vanish, it scatters across the pavement, reacting to the car's physics. The level of environmental destruction was something the studio was incredibly proud of, as it allowed the player to feel the raw power of the Dark Knight's arsenal. The Batmobile even extended its influence into the Riddler's twisted games. Edward Nygma had spent 2 games trying to outsmart Batman with logic puzzles and hidden trophies, but for the finale, he decided to build massive underground racing circuits. These tracks were designed to test your mastery over the vehicle's controls, featuring wall-running sections, massive jumps, and traps that moved in sync with the environment. It was a bizarre, almost Mario Kart meets Saw vibe that only a character like the Riddler could pull off. Some fans found these sections frustrating, but they served as a testament to how deeply the car was woven into the logic of the game. It wasn't just a gimmick, it was the foundation upon which the final version of Gotham was built. Speaking of the city itself, the design of the 3 islands, Bleak, Miagani, and Founders, was a masterstroke of environmental storytelling. Each island had its own flavor. Bleak Island was the old heart of the city, filled with Gothic gargoyles, the iconic GCPD building, and the looming shadows of the Panessa Film Studios. Miagani was the neon-lit entertainment district, dominated by the massive Wayne Tower and the Botanical Gardens. Founders Island was the new Gotham, a construction zone where ultra-modern skyscrapers were being built right on top of the decaying remains of the old city. This verticality was essential for the new movement system. Since Batman could now eject from the car and soar into the sky, the buildings had to be taller and more detailed than ever before. You could perch on top of the highest spire in the city and look down to see the tiny headlights of the militia vehicles patrolling the streets below, a sight that made you feel like a true guardian of the night. But while the city was getting bigger, the story was becoming much more intimate and focused. The choice to make the Scarecrow the primary antagonist was a brilliant move that allowed the series to lean back into its psychological horror roots. After the chaos of the Joker's reign, Jonathan Crane brought a different kind of threat, one that wasn't about jokes or madness, but about cold, calculated fear. The voice acting for the character was handled by John Noble, whose deep, gravelly delivery made every threat feel like a death sentence. He didn't just want to kill Batman. He wanted to unmask him and show the world that the invincible Dark Knight was just a man who was terrified of his own shadow. This psychological pressure was made even worse by the introduction of the Arkham Knight himself. For months leading up to the game's release, Rocksteady insisted that this was a brand new character, someone we had never seen before in the comics or the movies. This sparked a firestorm of theories among the fan base. Who was this mysterious commander who knew all of Batman's moves? Who was the man behind the glowing blue mask who commanded an army of mercenaries with such efficiency? When the truth was finally revealed that it was Jason Todd, the former Robin who had been tortured and broken by the Joker, it was a moment that hit like a ton of bricks for some, while others felt they had predicted it from the start. Regardless of whether you saw it coming, the execution was heartbreaking. Rocksteady used the hallucination system to show us flashes of Jason's torment, forcing the player to witness the very moment Batman failed his protege. This gave the conflict a personal weight that a brand new character could never have achieved. Jason wasn't just a villain, he was a mirror of Batman's greatest failure. The design of his suit was specifically crafted to be an anti-Batman. It was tactical, sleek, and filled with tech designed to counter every gadget in Bruce's utility belt. His helmet featured a heads-up display that mimicked Batman's own detective vision, allowing him to track the player's movements and anticipate their tactics. It turned the Predator missions on their head. For the first time, the hunter was being hunted by someone who knew all his tricks. But even with the high-stakes war for the city taking center stage, the developers didn't stop hiding the kind of small, missable moments that defined the series. One of the most famous examples is the Man-Bat jump scare. If you are gliding through the city on a quiet night, minding your own business, you might grapple onto a rooftop only to be greeted by a screaming, leather-winged monster flying right into your face. It is a legendary moment that has caused countless players to drop their controllers in genuine terror. What makes it even better is the internal logic behind it. The game actually tracks your progress and waits for a moment of calm before triggering the scare. And if you think you're safe after you've captured Kirk Langstrom and locked him in a cell at the GCPD, think again. If you return to the game on Halloween night in real time, you will find that the cell is empty, and the Man-Bat is once again loose in the city, leading to a second, even more unexpected jump scare. The attention to detail in the voice acting and soundscapes also reached a new peak in the final chapter. Every thug on the street had hundreds of lines of ambient dialogue that would change based on the events of the story. If you took out a major villain like the Penguin, the henchmen would start whispering about who was going to take over his territory. If the Scarecrow's fear toxin began to leak into the streets, their conversations would become more panicked and paranoid. You could spend hours just sitting on a gargoyle, listening to the petty squabbles and desperate dreams of the criminals below. It made the city feel like it was inhabited by people, not just targets for your fists. Rocksteady also made sure to pay tribute to the wider DC universe in ways that were much more than just name-dropping. In the GCPD evidence room, you can find the belongings of almost every villain Batman has ever faced. Each item has an associated audio recording from Aaron Cash, the veteran guard who has seen it all. These recordings serve as a chronological history of the entire series, referencing events from the Asylum, the city, and even the prequel. You can see the Joker's old joy buzzer, the Riddler's shattered cane, and the remains of the Titan formula. It's a quiet, reflective space that allows the player to look back on how far they've come. But it wasn't just the past that the developers were looking toward. They also hid hints about the future of the world beyond Gotham. If you listen to the radio messages in the city, you can hear mentions of Metropolis, Central City, and Bloodhaven. There are even voicemails at Wayne Tower from Lex Luthor himself, offering to buy out parts of Bruce's company. These weren't just Easter eggs, they were the building blocks of a universe that felt vast and alive. Rocksteady wanted you to know that while Batman was fighting for his life in Gotham, the rest of the world was still moving, unaware of the darkness that was threatening to consume the city. One of the most complex systems they introduced for the finale was the dual play mechanic. This allowed you to fight alongside allies like Robin, Nightwing, and Catwoman in real time. The transition between characters was handled with a level of polish that felt almost magical. You could be in the middle of a massive brawl as Batman, initiate a special takedown, and then seamlessly take control of Nightwing to finish the combo. Each partner had their own unique fighting style and animations. Nightwing was acrobatic and relied on his electrified Eskrima sticks, while Robin used his folding staff to create a more defensive, sweeping style of combat. These sequences weren't just about cool moves, they were about the theme of family. For 3 games, Batman had tried to push everyone away, insisting that he had to work alone. But in the final hour, he was forced to accept that he couldn't save Gotham by himself. This theme of the Bat family was also reflected in the side missions. The Most Wanted system returned, but with much more variety and narrative depth. You had to track down the Penguin's hidden weapon caches with the help of Nightwing, which led to some of the best banter in the game. You had to stop Two-Face's bank heists, which forced you to use the Batmobile's speed to jump from one location to another. And then there was the mission to save Catwoman from the Riddler's orphanage, which involved some of the most complex cooperative puzzles in the series. These missions didn't just feel like boxes to check off a list, they felt like essential chapters in the life of the Dark Knight. One of the most grisly and memorable side stories involved the character of Professor Pig. Laszlo Valentin is a villain who represents the extreme end of body horror in the Batman universe. He kidnaps imperfect people and transforms them into mindless, doll-like servants called Dollatrons. The hunt for Pig was framed as a gruesome detective mystery, where you had to analyze mutilated bodies found hanging throughout the city. The sound of opera music playing in the background as you approached each crime scene added a layer of refined madness that was truly unsettling. When you finally tracked him down to his parlor, the ensuing boss fight was a chaotic mess of flying cleavers and chanting doll slaves. It was a stark reminder that even without the Joker, Gotham was still home to some of the most depraved minds in fiction. The technical brilliance of the game also extended to the smaller details of the character models. Batman's suit in the final game was a complex assembly of over 100 individual pieces, each with its own material properties. As the night went on, the suit would show the wear and tear of the mission. You could see the scrapes on the metal plates where bullets had grazed him, the dirt on the cape after a fight in a construction zone, and the blood on his knuckles. Even the way the rain interacted with the suit was dynamic. If you stood in a downpour, the water would pool in the crevices of the armor and then stream off as you began to move. This level of visual fidelity was unprecedented at the time and still holds up today as a benchmark for graphical quality. Even the lighting system was built to enhance the atmosphere of a city on the edge. The neon signs of the shops would cast colorful reflections on the wet asphalt, creating a cyber-gothic look that was unique to this entry. The developers used a technique called volumetric lighting to make the searchlights of the militia helicopters feel thick and tangible as they cut through the rainy air. When the Scarecrow eventually detonates his cloudburst device, the entire city is covered in a thick, mustard-colored fog of fear. Navigating the city in this state was a completely different experience. You couldn't see the ground, so you had to rely on your grappling hook and your knowledge of the skyline to move. It was a claustrophobic, terrifying sequence that perfectly captured the feeling of a city losing its soul. The developers also hid a very specific sentimental secret for the fans who had been there from the beginning. In the final climactic sequence of the game, as Batman is fighting his mental battle against the Joker, you find yourself back in the hallways of Arkham Asylum. The environment is a perfect recreation of the first game's map, but twisted and distorted by Bruce's deteriorating mind. It was a beautiful way to bring the series full circle, reminding the player of where it all started. You could see the same doors, the same tiles, and even the same lighting cues that had defined the 2009 masterpiece. It was a moment of pure nostalgia that served as a fitting prelude to the final, world-shaking conclusion. This commitment to the fans was also evident in the way they handled the true ending of the game. To see the full resolution of the Nightfall Protocol, you had to achieve 100% completion, which meant finding every single one of the Riddler's 243 trophies and riddles. It was a monumental task that many complained about, but for those who persevered, the reward was a cinematic finale that left the fate of Batman a mystery. Was he truly gone, or had he transformed into something even more terrifying than a man in a mask? The final shot of a nightmare version of Batman descending upon a group of criminals in a dark alley suggested that the legend would never truly die, it would only evolve. As we look back on the labor that went into making this final chapter, it becomes clear that Rocksteady wasn't just trying to make a sequel. They were trying to create the definitive Batman experience, a digital museum where every gadget, every villain, and every square inch of the city was a tribute to 75 years of history. They took the rhythmic combat of a simple prototype and expanded it into a sprawling psychological war. They took a silent, soaring hero and gave him a roaring, fire-breathing machine. And through it all, they never lost the human heart of the story. The idea that even the strongest man has a breaking point, and that the only thing more powerful than fear is the hope that someone will be there to fight back when the lights go out. The story of the Arkham series is one of escalating ambition. It started with a small, focused nightmare on an island and ended with a global war for the soul of a city. It proved that video games could handle the complexity of a character as legendary as Batman, providing a level of immersion that movies and comics could only dream of. Every secret we uncover, from the hidden messages in the radio waves to the silent tributes in the GCPD, is a reminder of the thousands of people who dedicated years of their lives to making us feel, if only for a few hours, like we were the ones standing on that gargoyle, watching over the city, ready to jump. The transition from the tight, controlled environment of the asylum to the sprawling, vertical jungle of Gotham City was a journey that took years of creative evolution. But by the time we reached the final chapter, Rocksteady had perfected what many call the Batman simulator. It is one thing to give a player a cape and some gadgets, but it is another thing entirely to create a world so responsive that you begin to think like the world's greatest detective yourself. In this final outing, the stakes weren't just about stopping a riot or a localized breakout, they were about the very soul of the city, and that weight was felt in every single frame of the experience. The technical leap allowed the developers to do things with atmosphere that were previously just dreams during the development of the earlier titles. For instance, the rain wasn't just a visual filter anymore. The way the droplets interacted with the various materials, the matte carbon fiber of the armor, the heavy fabric of the cape, the cold steel of the rooftops, was handled with such precision that it added a layer of immersion that was almost tactile. You could practically feel the chill of the Gotham air through the screen. One of the most profound aspects of this final journey was the swan song performance of Kevin Conroy. While we have talked about the legendary chemistry between him and Mark Hamill, the work Conroy put into the final game was truly a masterclass in vocal range. Because the story was so much darker and more personal, he had to portray a Batman who was nearing his breaking point. Throughout the series, Conroy had always played the character with a sense of iron-willed stoicism. But in this finale, you could hear the cracks in the armor. Whether he was recording lines for a quiet conversation with Alfred, or shouting a desperate warning to a teammate, every syllable carried the weight of a man who knew the end was near. The recording sessions for this game were massive, with thousands of lines covering every possible player action, every suit choice, and every failed mission. It is a legendary performance that serves as a fitting legacy for the man who, for many of us, simply was Batman. The internal struggle Bruce Wayne faced was made physically manifest through the return of the Joker, who had become a permanent resident of Batman's psyche. This was more than just a clever way to keep a popular villain in the story. It was a fundamental shift in how the game communicated with the player. The Joker would appear randomly as you moved through the city, often leaning against a gargoyle or sitting on a railing, providing a running commentary on your every move. What made this so effective was the sheer unpredictability of it. Sometimes he would be there to mock your combat style, and other times he would whisper dark truths about Bruce's past that were designed to rattle the player's confidence. The developers even used subtle tricks to mess with your perception of the environment. You might be walking down a hallway and see a series of posters, only for them to transform into images of the Joker when you look away and look back. It was a constant, shimmering reminder that the protagonist's mind was fracturing, and it forced the player to question what was real and what was merely a trick of the fear-addled brain. To pull off this level of psychological immersion, the team had to ensure that the city itself was a masterpiece of seamless design. One of the most impressive technical feats in the final entry was the complete removal of loading interruptions during gameplay. In the earlier games, there was always a slight pause or a clever transition when moving into a major interior, but for the finale, Rocksteady wanted the world to be entirely continuous. This meant that the logic governing the city had to be incredibly efficient at pulling new information from the storage drives while the player was in the middle of a high-speed chase. This achievement cannot be overstated. Being able to glide from the highest point of Wayne Tower, drop into the streets, enter the Batmobile, and then drive into a high-tech facility without ever losing control or seeing a progress bar was a milestone for the genre. It allowed for a flow that extended beyond just the combat, making the entire night feel like one long, uninterrupted struggle for survival. This brings us to the physics of the world, which were significantly ramped up to handle the introduction of the Batmobile. The car wasn't just a separate gameplay element, it was a heavy, destructive force that interacted with every piece of the environment. The team had to essentially rebuild the collision logic for the entire city. When you drove the Batmobile through a stone pillar or a metal fence, the object wouldn't just disappear or clip through the vehicle. Instead, it would shatter into individual pieces that would bounce off the chassis and scatter across the road based on the momentum of the impact. This created a sense of raw power that made the vehicle feel like it belonged in Batman's arsenal. It was a physical manifestation of his unstoppable force, nature. The sound design for the car was equally obsessed with realism. They didn't just use a generic engine roar, they recorded the sounds of jet turbines and heavy machinery, layering them together to create a mechanical growl that felt terrifyingly powerful. Every time the thrusters ignited or the wheels shifted into battle mode, the soundscape would vibrate with a bass-heavy rumble that you could feel in your bones. The environmental storytelling reached a peak in the Panessa Film Studios, a location that served as a secret base for Batman's research into the Joker's lingering infection. This area was a treasure trove of lore and hidden details. Each of the 4 patients held there represented a different aspect of the Joker's personality that was being amplified by the infected blood. You had the obsessive showman, the violent brute, the cold intellectual, and the tragic victim. If you spent enough time observing them in their cells, you would see them performing behaviors that mirrored the Joker's own history. The studios themselves were filled with nods to the film industry and the history of Gotham's entertainment district. But beneath the surface, it was a dark laboratory where Bruce was forced to confront the monster he was becoming. One of the most chilling secrets in this area was the Stage B area, where you could find evidence of the horrific things the Joker had done to his victims in the past, including a hidden tape recorder that played back some of his most depraved moments. As the night progressed, the GCPD headquarters became the living heart of the game. Unlike the previous titles where the police were often distant or hostile, here they were your last line of defense. The building would physically change as you brought in more criminals. The holding cells would fill up with the thugs you captured on the streets, and the most wanted villains would be placed in maximum security cells where you could actually walk up and talk to them. This created a visible sense of progress. You could see the fruits of your labor as the city's worst elements were slowly removed from the streets and placed behind bars. The interactions with NPCs like Aaron Cash and Commissioner Gordon were filled with unique dialogue that would update based on which side missions you had completed. If you rescued a group of firemen or stopped a bank heist, the cops would comment on it as you walked past, making you feel like your actions were truly having an impact on the morale of the city. In the middle of all this darkness, the developers still found room for some incredibly fun cameos and meta references. One of the most famous is the inclusion of Sefton Hill himself as a character in the game. In the opening scene at the diner, you can see a man who looks exactly like the creative director sitting at one of the tables, a quiet nod to the man who spent a decade of his life building this universe. But the references didn't stop with the staff. The game was also a love letter to the wider DC universe, even if those other heroes never appeared on screen. We have mentioned the Lex Luthor voicemails and the Superman references, but the depth of these hints was truly staggering. You could find posters for the Flying Graysons at the carnival, a heartbreaking reminder of Dick Grayson's origins. You could find shipping crates marked with Queen Industries, a nod to Oliver Queen, better known as the Green Arrow. There were even mentions of the city of Bloodhaven and the legendary hero Nightwing's solo career there. It felt like Gotham wasn't an isolated bubble, but rather a central pillar in a massive world filled with gods and monsters. The side missions in this final entry were more than just distractions. They were deep dives into some of the most fascinating characters in the Batman mythos. Take the mission involving Deacon Blackfire, for example. It took players to the base of the Lady of Gotham statue, where a fanatical religious cult was performing human sacrifices. It was a grisly, atmospheric quest that touched on the darker, more occult side of the city's history. Then there was the return of Hush, whose story had been building since the second game. Seeing the final confrontation between Bruce Wayne and the man who had stolen his face was a moment of high tension that relied more on character drama than on combat. Even the legendary assassin Deathstroke made a return, serving as the commander of the militia after the Arkham Knight was defeated. While some fans were disappointed that his encounter was primarily a tank battle, his presence added a layer of tactical threat to the final hours of the campaign. The Season of Infamy expansion further enriched this world by bringing back some of the most iconic villains for a final bow. The return of Killer Croc was a highlight, as he had undergone a horrifying mutation that made him look less like a man and more like a true monster. His quest took you to a crashed prison airship, where the atmosphere was thick with dread and the smell of the swamp. Then there was the conclusion to the story of Mr. Freeze, which provided a surprisingly emotional and peaceful ending for one of Batman's most tragic foes. For the first time, you weren't fighting Victor Fries to stop him. You were helping him find a way to spend his final moments with his wife in peace. It was a beautiful, somber moment that showed the maturity of the writing team. They understood that not every conflict in Gotham has to end with a punch. Sometimes it ends with a quiet goodbye. All of these threads eventually led to the Nightfall Protocol, the final, definitive ending to the Arkham Trilogy. To unlock the full version of this ending, the player had to go above and beyond, achieving 100% completion by capturing every villain and solving every last one of the Riddler's challenges. It was a grueling requirement, but for those who saw it through, the reward was a cinematic conclusion that felt both epic and haunting. The Protocol was Bruce Wayne's ultimate contingency plan, a way to protect his allies and his legacy by removing Batman from the equation entirely. The final shot of Wayne Manor exploding while a crowd of reporters watched was a moment that felt incredibly final. It was Rocksteady's way of saying that their story was done, and they were leaving the character in a place where he could finally find rest, even if the legend itself lived on. The debate over the true end of the game continues to this day among the community. Was Bruce truly in that house? Did he fake his death to become a more permanent, mythic version of the Batman? The very last scene, showing a nightmare-like figure terrifying a group of muggers in an alleyway, suggested that the symbol of the bat had evolved into something even more powerful than a man. It was a perfect ending for a series that had always been about the power of fear. By stripping away the man and leaving only the shadow, Batman had finally become the incorruptible force he always wanted to be. This conclusion felt earned because we had spent 3 games witnessing the physical and mental toll the mission had taken on Bruce. We had seen him lose his friends, his mentors, and his own sanity, and seeing him finally transcend his humanity was a powerful closing note. The technical jump to the next generation of hardware also meant that the character models themselves were more detailed than anything we had ever seen in a superhero game. If you zoomed in on Batman's face during a close-up, you could see the individual pores in his skin, the stubble on his jaw, and the subtle reflections in his eyes. The animation system was similarly refined, with a much more fluid transition between different states of motion. The way Batman would shift his weight as he moved from a sprint into a slide, or the way his cape would ripple and fold as he landed from a glide, was handled with an attention to detail that bordered on the obsessive. This level of polish was necessary to make the high-speed movement of the final game feel grounded. If the animations had been stiff, the player would have felt disconnected from the world, but instead, every move felt intentional and heavy. This obsession with detail even extended to the way the city's lighting was handled. Gotham was a city of contrasts, deep, impenetrable shadows, and bright, garish neon. The developers used a sophisticated lighting system to make the searchlights of the militia helicopters feel like physical objects that could cut through the thick rain and fog. When you were hiding on a rooftop and a searchlight passed over you, the way the light hit the wet surfaces of the building and created long, shifting shadows was a technical marvel. It added a layer of tension to the stealth segments, as you had to constantly be aware of the light and how it would give away your position. It turned the city itself into an obstacle that you had to navigate with as much care as any group of armed guards. In many ways, the final game was a digital museum of everything that had come before. It was a celebration of the series' history, from the rhythmic combat prototypes to the sprawling urban epic it had become. Rocksteady took every lesson they had learned over a decade of development and poured it into one final ambitious project. They weren't afraid to take risks, whether it was killing off the main villain in the previous game or forcing the player to spend half the night in a tank. And while not every decision was universally loved, the sheer craftsmanship on display was undeniable. They had succeeded in creating a version of Batman that was truly our own, a hero who was defined as much by his failures and his fears as he was by his strength and his gadgets. As we look back on the journey from that first night at the asylum to the final sunrise over Gotham, we are reminded of the power of a clear vision. Rocksteady knew exactly what they wanted their Batman to be, and they never wavered from that path. They understood that to truly be the Batman, you have to be willing to descend into the darkest parts of the human soul and come out the other side with your resolve unbroken. Through the clever use of psychological tricks, the introduction of world-shaking vehicles, and a narrative that wasn't afraid to be tragic, they created a trilogy that will be remembered as a high watermark for the medium. Every secret we find, every riddle we solve, and every time we dive off that highest skyscraper into the rainy night, we are participating in a legacy that redefined what it means to be a hero in the digital age. The final hours of the experience were filled with a sense of pre-rendered drama that was actually happening in real time. Because the game didn't rely on pre-made videos for its story beats, whatever costume the player chose to wear would be visible in every single cinematic. This might seem like a small detail, but it was another pillar of the studio's commitment to immersion. If you wanted to play through the entire finale wearing the bright colors of the 1960s TV show suit, the game would let you, even if it made the serious, dramatic moments look a little bit ridiculous. It was a gift to the fans, allowing them to tailor their own version of the legend. This flexibility, combined with the rock-solid mechanics and the dense, secret-filled world, made the Arkham series a once-in-a-generation achievement. It was a perfect storm of talent, technology, and a deep, abiding love for a character who has inspired millions for nearly a century. When we look at the sheer scale of the final entry in the trilogy, we have to recognize that the ambition of the studio didn't just stop with the main campaign. They wanted to create a persistent, ongoing conversation with the community, and this led to the creation of the Arkham Insider series. This was a fascinating moment in the history of the studio because it saw them pull back the curtain in a way that few AAA developers had done before. Hosted by the charismatic Dax Ginn, these videos were more than just promotional trailers. They were deep dives into the technical and creative philosophy that fueled the development of Gotham's finale. You had designers like Adam Doherty explaining the intricacies of the dual play system, showing exactly how the animation blending allowed for two distinct characters to share a single combat flow without breaking the rhythmic heart of the experience. They talked about the Fear multi-takedown not as a simple power-up, but as a carefully balanced tool that was designed to make the player feel like the ultimate predator while still maintaining the challenge of the updated enemy AI. This period of transparency allowed fans to see just how much effort went into the visual fidelity of the world. They showcased the new skin shaders that allowed the characters to look realistic under the harsh neon-lit rain. You could see the way the moisture would collect in the wrinkles of a character's face, or how the light would refract through a drop of water on Batman's cowl. And it was a testament to the custom-built modifications they had made to their engine. They weren't just using the standard tools provided by the software, they were rewriting the very logic of how light and shadow interacted with different surfaces. This level of dedication was necessary because the leap to the next generation of hardware meant that the old tricks, the flat textures and simple lighting models, would no longer suffice. Every single asset in the city had to be rebuilt from the ground up to ensure that it could stand up to the scrutiny of a high-definition camera. However, as we have touched upon, this ambition was a double-edged sword. The technical complexity of the game, particularly the PC version, became a legendary cautionary tale in the industry. While the console versions were stable and breathtaking, the PC port was plagued by issues that went far beyond simple optimization. The heavy reliance on external NVIDIA features meant that even the most powerful rigs were struggling to maintain a consistent frame rate. There were hidden strings in the internal records that revealed the game was frequently bottlenecked by its own complex particle simulations. Thousands of individual sparks, raindrops, and scraps of paper were being calculated in real time, and without the proper optimization, this caused the system to buckle under the weight. It was a shame because the visual splendor was there, hidden beneath a layer of technical instability that took months to fully resolve. Eventually, the game was pulled from digital storefronts, a move that sent shockwaves through the community, but was ultimately necessary to give the team the time they needed to fix the underlying scripts and logic. During this time of technical rebuilding, the community of data miners, or rather the digital archivists who enjoy digging through game files, discovered a treasure trove of content that had been left on the cutting room floor. They found references to a mode called $1 Million Mayhem, which would have seen the player take control of the Joker for a timed rampage through the city. This wasn't just a simple idea. The files contained specific score counters, unique dialogue lines, and even a startup file that allowed for a playable Joker profile. The idea was that the Joker would cause as much destruction as possible, with the repair costs being billed directly to Wayne Enterprises. Seeing these remnants in the internal records gave fans a glimpse into a much more playful, chaotic version of the game that might have existed if the tone hadn't shifted toward a more serious, brooding finale. They also found unused models for characters like Prometheus and Black Mask, suggesting that the most wanted list was originally intended to be even more expansive than what we got in the final release. This level of hidden content is a recurring theme throughout the series. Rocksteady loved to reward the curious by hiding entire story arcs in the background of their maps. If you take a stroll through the Founders Island district, you can find various storefronts that serve as a love letter to the history of the DC universe. There is a shop named after Zatanna, the legendary magician, and another that references the Secret Six, a group of villains turned mercenaries. These aren't just names. They are part of a larger effort to make Gotham feel like the center of a much larger world. You can find travel posters for the island of Santa Prisca, the birthplace of Bane, and advertisements for LexCorp, the company owned by Superman's nemesis. It created a feeling that while Batman was focused on the immediate threat of the Scarecrow, the rest of the world was continuing to turn, filled with its own heroes and villains who were just out of frame. One of the most heartwarming and subtle references in the final game is the gay ghost, or gray ghost posters scattered throughout the city. This is a direct nod to Batman the Animated Series, where a young Bruce Wayne was inspired to become a hero by watching a fictional television show featuring a character voiced by the legendary Adam West. By including this in the final chapter of the trilogy, the developers were paying tribute to the history of the character across all forms of media. It served as a bridge between the campy, bright era of the 1960s and the dark, gritty reality of the Arkhamverse. It was a reminder that the Batman we know today is built on the foundation of everything that came before, and Rocksteady was careful to acknowledge every part of that legacy. The Batgirl, A Matter of Family DLC, which was developed by the team at WB Games Montreal, continued this trend of deep-cut references. Set in a derelict amusement park on the water, the environment was a masterpiece of creepy carnival aesthetics. Hidden deep within the park was a massive containment tank holding a giant one-eyed starfish. For the uninitiated, this was Starro the Conqueror, the very first villain the Justice League ever fought in the comics. Seeing such a massive cosmic threat reduced to a hidden Easter egg in a side story was a brilliant way to show the scale of the universe. It hinted that while Batman's world was grounded in street-level crime and psychological trauma, there were much stranger things lurking in the depths of the ocean and the reaches of space. Even the way the game handled its most famous gadgets was filled with secrets. We have discussed the remote electrical charge and the freeze blast, but the way these items were placed in the world showed a level of confidence in the player's ability to explore. The developers didn't feel the need to hold your hand or provide a massive quest marker for every single tool. Instead, they left them in logical places, the GCPD evidence room or the movie studios, and waited for the player to find them. This gave the experience a sense of discovery that is often missing from modern games. When you break the glass of an evidence case to reclaim your old gear, it feels like an earned moment of empowerment rather than a scripted progression point. It reinforced the idea that Batman is a man who is always prepared, even when his city is falling apart around him. The Fear Multi-Takedown was another masterclass in design that evolved from these earlier ideas of empowerment. It was more than just a flashy animation. It was a way to solve a specific problem in the game's combat logic. As the enemies in the final game became more sophisticated, using thermal goggles, jammers, and mines, the standard stealth approach became much more difficult. The fear system allowed the player to turn the tables, using the terrifying presence of the Batman to strike multiple targets before they could even draw their weapons. It required a specific type of setup, usually involving a silent takedown to charge the meter, which encouraged a mix of quiet stalking and explosive action. The transition into the slow-motion targeting phase was handled with a level of polish that made every strike feel impactful. You could see the terror in the eyes of the thugs as the Dark Knight moved between them with superhuman speed, a visual representation of how the criminals of Gotham perceived their legendary tormentor. This focus on the psychological impact of the Batman was also reflected in the updated detective mode. Throughout the series, this mode had been a bit of a reliance for players, a digital aid that some felt made the game too easy. For the finale, the developers added new layers of complexity to the system. Enemies could now detect when Batman was using his scanner, forcing the player to be much more tactical about when they activated it. There were jammer units that would scramble the signal entirely, leaving you blind in the middle of a predator encounter. This created a back-and-forth dynamic where you had to prioritize certain targets to regain your technical advantage. It was a brilliant way to prevent the mechanic from becoming a dull shortcut, turning it instead into a vital resource that had to be managed with care. The sound design in the final game was equally obsessed with these nuances. The score, composed by Nick Arundel and David Buckley, was a sweeping orchestral epic that could shift from a quiet, tension-filled string arrangement to a bombastic, brass-heavy anthem in a heartbeat. But it was the ambient soundscapes that truly sold the experience. If you stood on a rooftop in the middle of a storm, you could hear the individual sounds of the city below. The distant sirens, the hum of the militia drones, the rhythmic splashing of the rain against the metal vents. The developers used a sophisticated audio propagation system that allowed sounds to bounce realistically off the buildings and through the alleyways. It meant that a shout from a thug on the street would sound different depending on whether you were perched directly above him or hidden behind a nearby chimney. This level of audio fidelity added a layer of depth to the world that made it feel truly three-dimensional. One of the most fascinating characters to emerge from this final chapter was the Scarecrow himself. His redesign for the finale was a masterwork of horror aesthetics. Instead of the simple burlap sack he wore in the first game, his new mask was a grisly fusion of rotting canvas and surgical tubing, designed to look like a permanent, horrific part of his face. His voice, provided by John Noble, had a terrifying, calm authority to it. He didn't shriek like a madman, He spoke with the cold, logical precision of a scientist who was conducting a massive experiment on the population of Gotham. The way he used the cloudburst to drown the city in fear gas was one of the most memorable sequences in the series, transforming the vibrant neon streets into a choking, orange nightmare. Navigating the city during this phase was a haunting experience, as the familiar landmarks were swallowed by the mist, leaving you alone with your own fears and the haunting laughter of the Joker echoing in your ears. The relationship between the Batman and his allies also reached an emotional climax in this entry. The dual play mechanic was the physical manifestation of this bond, but the narrative went even deeper. For years, Bruce had tried to maintain a wall between himself and the people he cared about. Dick Grayson, Tim Drake, Barbara Gordon, fearing that his mission would eventually consume them too. In the final game, that wall was torn down. You saw the genuine affection and respect between Batman and his protégés, even as they disagreed on his increasingly desperate tactics. The missions where you fought alongside Nightwing to take down the Penguin's weapon caches were filled with a sense of history and mutual trust. The banter between the two characters felt natural and earned, a reminder that while Batman might be a solitary figure, he is not a lonely one. He has built a family out of the ruins of his past, and seeing them come together to save their city was a powerful emotional core for the series. This focus on family was also central to the tragedy of the Arkham Knight. As we have discussed, the reveal that the antagonist was Jason Todd was a moment of profound sadness. It wasn't just about a betrayal, it was about the failure of the ideal of the Batman. Jason was the boy who had looked up to Bruce as a father figure, only to be abandoned in his darkest hour. His journey from a vengeful commander back to the Red Hood was a redemption arc that felt messy and human. He wasn't a perfect hero, and he wasn't an irredeemable villain. He was a broken man trying to find his place in a world that had forgotten him. The way his suit evolved throughout the game, from the tactical blue of the Arkham Knight to the iconic red of his final vigilante form, was a visual representation of his shifting identity. The developers also made sure to include plenty of nods to the fans who had been following the series since the very beginning. In the movie studios, you could find a series of interview tapes that provided additional context for the events of the earlier games. You could hear the Joker's final thoughts before his death, the Scarecrow's journals detailing his recovery after being mauled by Killer Croc, and even the internal memos of the Arkham staff as they tried to maintain order during the various breakouts. It created a sense of a closed loop where every question was eventually answered and every loose thread was eventually tied up. It showed that the writers had a clear vision for the entire trilogy from the very start, even if they didn't know exactly how the technology would evolve to help them tell that story. Even the way the credits were handled in the final game was a testament to the studio's creativity. While the interactive fight against the developers was eventually cut, the final sequence of the game, the true ending unlocked after 100% completion, was a masterclass in myth-making. It didn't provide a simple, happy resolution. Instead, it leaned into the idea that the Batman is more than just a man. He is an idea that can never truly be killed. The sight of the nightmare Batman descending upon the criminals of Gotham suggested that the legend had moved beyond the physical realm, becoming a permanent part of the city's darkness. It was a fitting end for a series that had spent a decade exploring the psychological and physical toll of being a hero. As we look at the legacy of the Arkham series, it is clear that its impact on the industry was profound. It set a new standard for how licensed properties could be handled, proving that a superhero game could be a serious, mature piece of art that appealed to both hardcore fans and casual players. The free-flow combat system became a staple of modern action games, and the Predator stealth mechanics redefined how developers approached tactical encounters. But more than that, it gave us a version of the Batman that felt definitive. It was a universe where the gadgets were cool, the villains were terrifying, and the hero was human. Every secret hidden in a locker, every riddle solved on a rooftop, and every whispered conversation heard from a gargoyle added a layer of depth to a world that felt incredibly real. Rocksteady didn't just build a game, they built a legacy. They took a rhythmic prototype and turned it into a sprawling psychological epic that will be studied and enjoyed for decades to hour. From the smallest technical detail to the grandest narrative flourish, the Arkham Trilogy is a testament to the power of passion, obsession, and the enduring appeal of the man in the mask. We are all lucky to have been along for the ride, and as we look toward the future, we can only hope that the next generation of developers takes as much care with their heroes as the team at Rocksteady did with theirs. The evolution of the most wanted missions in the final chapter also served to flesh out the world in unexpected ways. One of the most interesting additions was the perfect crime mystery, which felt like a true detective story. You had to follow a series of grisly clues, mutilated bodies displayed as art, across the city to track down Professor Pig. This mission didn't rely on combat or gadgets as much as it relied on observation and deduction. You had to use the deep tissue scanner to find unique markers on each victim, such as a surgical implant or a hidden scar, to identify who they were and why they were targeted. It was a stark departure from the explosive action of the main campaign, reminding the player that at his core, Batman is still a detective. The final confrontation in Pyg's surgery was a masterclass in body horror and unsettling atmosphere, providing a dark counterpoint to the more traditional superhero antics of the other villains. Similarly, the Firefly missions took advantage of the new Batmobile mechanics, creating high-speed chases that felt like something out of a blockbuster movie. Chasing the pyromaniac through the streets of Gotham while he rained fire down on your vehicle was a thrilling test of your driving skills. It wasn't just about speed, it was about avoiding obstacles and managing your thrusters to close the gap before he could escape. These missions provided a much-needed variety to the gameplay loop, ensuring that every time you sat down to play, you were doing something different. Whether you were dismantling a militia checkpoint, defusing a bomb in the middle of a street brawl, or tracking an invisible threat through the sewers, the game was constantly throwing new challenges your way. The Man-Bat quest, as we have mentioned, provided one of the greatest jump scares in gaming history, but it also told a tragic story about the dangers of scientific obsession. Tracking Kirk Langstrom through the skies of Gotham was a unique challenge that required you to use the audio tracking system to find him by the sound of his screeching. When you finally managed to tackle him midair and administer the cure, the transformation back into human form was handled with a level of graphic detail that was truly impressive. Seeing the broken man inside the monster added a layer of human cost to the chaos of the night. It was another example of how Rocksteady was able to take even the most comic book of characters and ground them in a reality that felt heavy and meaningful. Even the Riddler's final boss fight was a grand departure from the earlier games. Instead of just walking into a room and punching him, you had to fight a giant mechanical spider bot while coordinating with Catwoman. This fight required you to use every skill you had learned throughout the game, switching between characters, using specific gadgets to disable the bot's shields, and timing your attacks to avoid the deadly laser sweeps. It was a fittingly over-the-top conclusion for a character whose ego was his greatest weakness. When you finally hauled him away to the GCPD, his frantic excuses and desperate attempts to prove his superior intellect were a perfect closing note for one of the most persistent and annoying thorns in Batman's side. When we look into the final hours of the Arkham saga, the level of immersion achieved by the team at Rocksteady wasn't just a result of better hardware. It was a result of a deep, almost obsessive attention to the way the city reacted to the player. One of the most hauntingly beautiful sequences in the entire series occurs when the Scarecrow finally activates his cloudburst device, flooding the streets of Gotham with a concentrated version of his fear toxin. Suddenly, the vibrant, neon-lit skyline we had grown accustomed to was swallowed by a thick, suffocating orange mist. This wasn't just a visual filter or a change in lighting. It fundamentally altered how you navigated the world. The ground was no longer a safe place. If you descended too low, the screen would begin to distort, the music would swell into a discordant nightmare, and the health bar would rapidly deplete. It forced the player into the sky, making the grappling hook and the cape more vital than ever. The technical challenge of rendering this volumetric fog across an entire city was immense, especially since the team insisted on maintaining a seamless experience with no loading screens. They had to develop a specific way for the engine to handle the density of the gas, ensuring that it looked like a physical, swirling mass that reacted to the wind and the movements of the Batmobile as you tore through it. During this terrifying phase of the night, the Joker's presence inside Bruce's mind reached a fever pitch. This is where the developers really began to show off their mastery of environmental storytelling through hallucination. If you stopped to look at the statues throughout the city, many of them would slowly morph into the likeness of the Joker. Billboard advertisements for local businesses would subtly shift to feature his grinning face, only to snap back to normal the moment you tried to get a closer look. There is even a famous moment in the Panessa Film Studios where, if you turn around while looking at a series of posters, the entire room changes to reflect the Joker's twisted sense of humor. These weren't scripted cutscenes. They were dynamic changes to the world logic that happened in real time, designed to make the player feel as paranoid and unstable as the Dark Knight himself. The studio even went so far as to change the game over screens. Instead of the usual villain taunts, you would often see the Joker leaning over the camera, offering his own compassion or mockery of your failure. It was a brilliant way to keep the series' most iconic rivalry alive, proving that the Joker didn't need a physical body to be the most dangerous person in the room. The psychological weight of the story was also carried by the secondary characters, particularly Barbara Gordon. The sequence where Batman witnesses her apparent suicide under the influence of the toxin was one of the most controversial and heartbreaking moments in the series. Even though it was eventually revealed to be another hallucination, the impact on the player was profound. It served as a reminder that Bruce's greatest fear wasn't his own death, but the death of those he had brought into his war on crime. The voice work by Ashley Greene brought a vulnerability to Barbara that made her feel like the emotional anchor of the team. Her role as Oracle was more than just a radio voice. She was the intelligence hub that allowed the player to make sense of the chaos. The developers spent a huge amount of time designing her clock tower base, filling it with personal touches, photos of her father, mementos of her time as Batgirl, and high-tech equipment that felt lived in and functional. When the tower was eventually compromised by the militia, the feeling of violation was palpable. The militia itself, commanded by the mysterious Arkham Knight, was a far cry from the disorganized gangs of the earlier games. These were professional soldiers who used tactical formations, drones, and heavy armor to counter Batman's traditional methods. The AI for these enemies was significantly more aggressive, requiring the player to be much more deliberate in their approach. They would actively search for you, using thermal scanners to peer into grates and floor panels. They would deploy minigunners that couldn't be taken down with a simple strike, forcing you to use the environment or specific gadget combinations to survive. This escalation of force was a reflection of how the world was reacting to the legend of the Batman. The criminals of Gotham had finally stopped underestimating and started treating him as the tactical threat he truly was. This led to some of the most intense predator encounters in the series, where you were truly outnumbered and outgunned, relying on your wits and your utility belt to even the odds. Speaking of the utility belt, the gadgets in the final chapter were more versatile than ever. The voice synthesizer was a particularly clever addition, allowing you to mimic the voices of villains like Harley Quinn or the Arkham Knight to give conflicting orders to their henchmen. You could trick a guard into opening a locked door or walking right into a booby trap, a move that felt perfectly in line with Batman's deceptive nature. The Disruptor also received massive upgrades, allowing you to disable everything from sniper rifles to medic kits. The strategy of sabotaging an enemy's equipment and then watching their confusion as it failed in the heat of battle was incredibly satisfying. These tools weren't just about winning a fight, they were about controlling the flow of the encounter, turning the environment itself into a weapon against the invaders. The Batmobile's integration into these tactical scenarios was also more complex than it first appeared. While many remember the explosive tank battles, the vehicle was also used for stealth and puzzle solving. You could use the remote control feature to position the car while Batman was on foot, creating pincer attacks or using the winch to tear down walls and create new pathways. The winch mechanic was a surprisingly versatile tool, allowing you to power up generators, pull elevators, and even hoist the Batmobile up the sides of buildings. It turned the car into a multi-purpose tool that was essential for navigating the more vertical sections of the city. The developers even included a drone hack ability, allowing you to turn the militia's own tanks against them, creating chaotic distractions that allowed you to slip past heavy defenses unnoticed. One of the most impressive technical achievements was the dual play combat, which we have touched upon, but its mechanical depth deserves a closer look. When fighting alongside Nightwing or Robin, the game was essentially running two separate character scripts simultaneously, each with their own unique physics and animation sets. The way the camera would seamlessly track the swap during a takedown was a masterclass in cinematic direction that they had to, the AI-controlled partner didn't just stand around waiting for orders. They had to be an active participant in the fight, prioritizing targets and maintaining their own combos. This required a huge amount of programming work to ensure that the two characters wouldn't clip through each other or get stuck on the environment during their elaborate team attacks. The result was a combat experience that felt much larger in scale, emphasizing the idea that the Bat family was a unified force. The side missions in the finale were also much more than simple diversions. The Perfect Crime Mystery, featuring Professor Pig, was a grisly exploration of body horror that stood in stark contrast to the high-tech military thriller of the main plot. The opera music that would swell as you approached each crime scene created a sense of ritualistic madness that was truly unsettling. When you finally entered his surgery, the environment was a nightmare of blood-stained tiles and hanging meat hooks, reflecting the shattered mind of Laszlo Valentin. The fight against his Dolatrons, mindless servants who didn't feel pain, required a different tactical approach, as standard strikes wouldn't stop them. You had to use finishers and environmental takedowns to put them down for good. It was a reminder that even in the middle of a war, Gotham was still home to the kind of intimate, personal horrors that had defined the series since the very beginning. Similarly, the Man-Bat mission provided a tragic counterpoint to the more traditional villains. Kirk Langstrom wasn't an evil man, he was a scientist who had lost himself in his pursuit of a cure. The way his story unfolded, finding his wrecked lab, discovering the fate of his wife, and eventually tracking him through the skies, was a somber and emotional journey. The visual design of the creature was a horrifying blend of human and bat anatomy, and the way he would screech and thrash when captured was a chilling bit of sound design. If you took the time to read the files found in his lab, you could see the slow descent into madness, a common theme in the Batman universe where the desire to do good often leads to horrific results. The GCPD building itself served as a living record of your progress throughout the night. It was one of the most detailed environments in the game, filled with unique interactions and hidden secrets. As you captured the most wanted villains, they would be placed in high-security cells where you could actually walk up and hear them argue with each other. If you placed the Penguin and Two-Face in adjacent cells, they would trade insults and blame each other for the night's failures. Even the low-level thugs would comment on the state of the city, their dialogue updating based on your most recent victories. You could find the evidence room, which, as we discussed, was a digital museum of the entire series. Each item, from the Joker's old laughing gas canisters to the remains of the Scarecrow's mask from the first game, was a tribute to the long road you had traveled. It gave the finale a sense of weight and finality, making every arrest feel like a meaningful step toward reclaiming the city. The developers also hid some incredibly deep-cut references for the hardcore fans. We have mentioned the Secret Six and Zatanna signs, but there was also a very subtle nod to the Martian Manhunter hidden in the GCPD officer rosters. If you looked at the duty board, you could find the name John Jones, which is the human alias of John Johns. It was a quiet confirmation that the Justice League was active in this world, even if they were off-screen. There were also references to Queen Industries and LexCorp scattered across the shipping crates and billboards, suggesting a world where Bruce Wayne was just one of several billionaire philanthropists and villains who were shaping the future. Even the radio chatter would occasionally mention the freak from Metropolis or the speedster in Central City, grounding the gothic streets of Gotham in a much larger, brighter universe. The Season of Infamy expansion further enriched this experience by bringing back some of the most iconic villains for a final, emotional bow. The story of Mr. Freeze, in particular, was a highlight. Instead of another boss fight, it was a mission about compassion and peace. You had to help Victor Freeze defend his wife's cryogenic chamber from the militia, eventually leading to a quiet moment on a snowy ship where he chose to give up his suit and his frozen life to spend his final hours with Nora. It was a beautiful, melancholic ending for one of the most tragic characters in the mythos, showing that Rocksteady understood the human heart behind the icy exterior. In contrast, the return of the Mad Hatter was a surreal trip into a pop-up book world that served as a psychological interrogation of Batman's own history. It was a creative use of the game's visuals to represent a mind under attack, forcing you to fight through the pages of a twisted fairy tale. One of the most fascinating technical secrets involves the way the Man-Bat jump scare was programmed. The game wouldn't just trigger the event at a random time. It was designed to wait for a moment of quiet, usually after you had spent a significant amount of time gliding or exploring without getting into a fight. This ensured that the player's guard was down, making the scream and the sudden appearance of the creature far more effective. And the fact that this event could happen again on Halloween night in the real world showed that the developers were thinking about the player's experience long after they had finished the main story. It was a way to keep the world feeling alive and unpredictable, even during subsequent playthroughs. The true ending, unlocked through the Nightfall Protocol, was a bold creative choice that left the community debating for years. By destroying Wayne Manor and apparently sacrificing himself, Bruce Wayne was able to protect his friends and transform the legend of the Batman into something purely mythic. The final scene, showing a terrifying, nightmare-like version of the Dark Knight using fear toxin to frighten muggers, suggested that the symbol had transcended the man. This conclusion was foreshadowed throughout the trilogy, with various characters warning Bruce that he couldn't keep going forever. The physical and mental toll of the three games had been immense, and seeing him finally end the man to save the mission was a powerful closing note. It was a definitive way for Rocksteady to say goodbye to the character, leaving him in a place where he could never be broken again. The production of the final game was also a massive undertaking from a cinematic perspective. Because the game didn't use pre-rendered videos for its cutscenes, every moment was happening live within the engine. This meant that the lighting, the weather, and the player's choice of suit would all be reflected in every dramatic beat. If you were wearing the futuristic Batman Beyond armor, it would gleam in the rain as you had your final confrontation with the Scarecrow. If you chose the classic 1970s suit, the bright blue and gray would stand out against the gloomy Gothic architecture. This level of immersion was a primary goal for the studio, as it ensured that there was never a moment where the player felt like they were watching a movie instead of playing a game. Every transition from gameplay to story was seamless, maintaining the high-stakes flow that had become the hallmark of the series. Even the way the credits were designed showed a level of creativity that went beyond the standard scroll of names. While the interactive credits fight was unfortunately cut from the final release, the audio logs and hidden messages found during the post-game allowed the player to hear from the cast and crew in a way that felt personal. You could hear the actors reflecting on their characters, the writers talking about the themes of the trilogy, and the artists discussing their favorite designs. It was a celebration of a decade of hard work that had gone into making the Arkham series a reality. It felt like a community of fans coming together to say goodbye to a world they had grown to love. When we look back at the journey that started with a simple rhythm game prototype and ended with a world-shaking epic, the impact of the Arkham Trilogy on the industry is undeniable. It redefined what a superhero game could be, moving away from cheap movie tie-ins and toward a mature, complex exploration of a legendary character. The combat system, the Predator stealth, and the seamless world building became the new standard for action games, influencing everything from Spider-Man to Shadow of Mordor. But more than the technical innovations, it was the love for the character that stood out. Rocksteady didn't just give us a game, they gave us a chance to be the Batman. They allowed us to descend into the madness of the asylum, navigate the chaos of the city, and finally face the end with our resolve unbroken. Every secret hidden in a rainy alley, every riddle solved on a windswept rooftop, and every whispered conversation between thugs on the street was a part of a larger tapestry. The developers understood that Batman is not just a man in a suit. He is a symbol of justice, a master of fear, and a detective of the human soul. By building a world that reacted to our every move, they created a level of immersion that was truly unprecedented. We didn't just play through a story, we inhabited a myth. And as we look toward whatever comes next for the studio and the character, we can be certain that the shadow of the Arkham series will loom large over the industry for years to hour. It was a masterclass in game design, a love letter to a legend, and a journey that we will never forget. The level of detail even extended to the way the Batmobile was marketed and presented to the player. The developers knew that some would be skeptical of a tank-like vehicle in a Batman game, so they went to great lengths to justify its existence within the story. It wasn't just a toy, it was a necessity. In a city occupied by an army of tanks and drones, the standard Batmobile from the earlier years wouldn't have survived 5 minutes. Bruce had to escalate his technology to match the threat of the Arkham Knight. This narrative justification made the transition to the more action-heavy sequences feel earned. The car was a physical representation of the escalation that has always been a part of the Batman mythos. The idea that the hero must always be one step ahead of the chaos. Even the interior of the Batmobile was designed with an obsessive attention to detail. If you looked at the various screens and buttons in the cockpit while using the remote control, you could see the real-time record of the city's status, the vehicle's fuel levels, and the targeting logic of the weapon systems. These weren't just static textures, they were dynamic elements that reflected the current state of the game. The eject sequence, which allowed Batman to launch from the driver's seat into a high-altitude glide, was one of the most mechanically satisfying moves in the game. It required a perfect synchronization of physics and animation, ensuring that the momentum of the car was transferred to the player as they soared into the sky. It was a move that never got old, even after dozens of hours of play. The side missions involving the militia also served to make the city feel like an active war zone. You had to clear out watchtowers, dismantle checkpoints, and defuse massive explosive devices planted in the streets. These activities weren't just busy work, they were tactical challenges that required you to use all of your skills. To take down a watchtower, you might have to glide from a nearby skyscraper, use your disruptor to disable the sentry guns, and then engage in a high-stakes Predator encounter to clear the guards. To defuse a bomb, you had to protect the Batmobile from waves of drones while the upload completed, a frantic test of your combat driving and strafing abilities. Each of these activities felt like a meaningful contribution to the liberation of Gotham, giving the player a sense of agency in the middle of the chaos. One of the most memorable and haunting locations in the final game was the orphanage, where the Riddler had trapped Catwoman. This area was filled with complex cooperative puzzles that required you to switch between Batman and Catwoman to progress. These weren't just simple switches, they were elaborate logic traps that forced you to think 2 steps ahead. One character might have to stand on a pressure plate to reveal a sequence of lights for the other, or use a specific gadget to clear a path. The banter between Bruce and Selina during these segments was some of the best writing in the game, capturing their complicated history and mutual respect. It was a rare moment of levity in an otherwise dark story, showing that even in the face of death, the two could still find a way to work together. The Perfect Crime mission, as we have mentioned, was a deep dive into the world of Professor Pig, but the way it was structured was particularly interesting. Instead of a linear path, you had to find the victims scattered across the 3 islands. There were no map markers to guide you. You had to listen for the distant sound of opera music and look for the spotlights that Pig had placed over his art. This encouraged exploration and made the discovery of each crime scene feel organic. When you finally tracked him down to his parlor, the environment was a masterpiece of unsettling atmosphere. The flickering lights, the muffled sounds of the Dolatrons, and the erratic movements of Pig himself created a sense of pure dread. It was a grisly, intimate encounter that stood out in a game otherwise defined by massive tank battles and citywide threats. The Firefly missions were another example of how the game used the Batmobile to create unique challenges. Chasing the pyromaniac through the streets while he rained fire down on your vehicle was a thrilling test of your reflexes. You had to avoid the burning debris, manage your thrusters, and stay close enough to trigger the takedown before his fuel ran out. It was a high-speed game of cat and mouse that showcased the power and speed of the new vehicle. And when you finally caught him and hauled him back to the GCPD, the dialogue between him and the police was filled with the kind of colorful character work that made the villains of Gotham so memorable. They weren't just monsters. They were obsessed, driven individuals with their own dark agendas. The Deacon Blackfire mission, while shorter than some of the others, was a masterclass in atmospheric storytelling. It took place on a rainy, sacrificial altar at the base of the Lady of Gotham statue, where Blackfire was leading a cult of fanatical followers. The flickering torches, the chanting of the crowd, and the desperate struggle to save a hostage before time ran out created a sense of occult terror that was unique to this quest. It touched on a different side of the city's history, showing that Gotham has always been a place where the shadows are deep and the secrets are ancient. When you finally knocked out the Deacon and dispersed his followers, the sense of relief was real. It was a small but impactful reminder that Batman is the protector of every soul in Gotham, not just the ones caught in the crossfire of the major villains. Even the Riddler's final confrontation was a grand, cinematic event that felt like a fitting conclusion to his arc. For 3 games, he had been the ultimate annoyance, the man who thought he was smarter than the detective. Seeing him finally break down in his giant mechanical suit, screaming about his superior intellect even as you dismantled his toy, was incredibly satisfying. Hauling him to the GCPD and seeing him in a cell next to the people he looked down upon was the perfect irony. It was the ultimate defeat for a man whose ego was his greatest enemy. And as he sat there, frantically trying to solve his own defeat, the player could finally feel like they had truly outsmarted the smartest man in the room. As the night drew to a close and the first light of dawn began to touch the skyline, the city of Gotham felt different. It was battered, broken, and scarred by the war, but it was still standing. The feeling of reaching 100% completion and seeing the Nightfall Protocol for the first time was a moment of profound accomplishment. It was the end of a long, dark journey. And as the screen faded to black, the silence was earned. We had seen the hero fall, the legend rise, and the city survive. It was a perfect closing note for a trilogy that had given us everything it had. And as we look back on the thousands of hours spent in that world, we are reminded that some stories don't just end, they become a part of us. The Arkham Saga was one of those stories, a dance of shadows that will stay with us forever. Every secret, from the hidden messages in the radio waves to the silent tributes in the GCPD, was a reminder of the thousands of people who dedicated years of their lives to making us feel like we were the Batman. The technical brilliance, the narrative depth, and the sheer love for the source material made the Arkham series a once-in-a-generation achievement. It was a masterclass in how to treat a legendary character with respect while still pushing the boundaries of what a video game could be. And as we move forward into a new era of gaming, we can only hope that the next generation of developers takes as much care with their worlds as Rocksteady did with theirs. Because in the end, it's the details that matter, the swaying of a cape, the flicker of a neon sign, and the silent shadow watching over the city from a gargoyle. The expansion of the world in the final chapter was not just limited to the primary conflict with the Scarecrow and the Arkham Knight. It was also about the Season of Infamy, a series of additional story missions that brought back some of the most complex and fascinating individuals in the history of Gotham. These missions were a masterclass in how to weave additional content into an already dense narrative without it feeling like a distraction. One of the most emotionally resonant of these was In From the Cold, which served as the final resolution for Victor Fries, or Mr. Freeze. For years, Victor had been one of the most tragic figures in the series, a man who had turned himself into a monster solely to save the woman he loved. In this mission, we find him in a completely different light. He isn't the antagonist this time. He is a victim of the militia's ruthlessness. They have taken Nora's cryogenic chamber and are using it as leverage to force Victor into helping them. The environment for this mission was breathtaking. A massive, rusted ship stranded in the frozen harbor, surrounded by a swirling snowstorm that looked incredibly realistic on the modern hardware. As you navigate the ship, you can hear the wind howling through the metal structures and the rhythmic clanking of the machinery. The dialogue between Batman and Victor is filled with a sense of mutual exhaustion. They are two men who have spent years fighting a war that neither of them can ever truly win. When you finally rescue Nora, the game does something unexpected. It wakes her up. Seeing Nora Fries finally conscious and talking to Victor was a moment that many fans had been waiting for since the very first mention of the character. The tragedy, of course, is that she is dying, and Victor has to choose between keeping her frozen forever or spending a few final warm hours with her before she passes away. Choosing to let her wake up and see the sunset over the frozen ocean was one of the most human moments in the entire trilogy. It was a somber, beautiful conclusion for a character who had always represented the idea that love, when taken to an extreme, can become a prison. In contrast to the quiet tragedy of Mr. Freeze, the Shadow War mission involving Ra's al Ghul was a high-stakes exploration of the internal conflict within the League of Assassins. The story picks up after the events of Arkham City, revealing that Ra's is being kept alive by a massive, high-tech life support system, but his body is little more than a decaying husk. The League has split into two factions, those loyal to Ra's and those following his daughter Nisa, who wants to end her father's suffering and lead the League in a new direction. This mission presented the player with one of the most difficult moral choices in the series. Do you provide Ra's with the pure Lazarus shroud to restore his youth and power, knowing that he will continue his global crusade of purification? Or do you destroy the machines and let the ancient leader finally die, effectively committing an act of mercy that goes against Batman's strict no-killing rule? The level design for this mission took you deep into the ruins of Elliott Memorial Hospital, an area that felt ancient and decayed, perfectly mirroring the state of the League itself. The combat encounters were intense, featuring the shadow assassins who could teleport and use swords to parry your strikes. It forced you to be much more reactive in your fighting style, using the rhythmic counters that had defined the series since the very beginning. The final choice was handled with a level of weight that made you pause. If you chose to save Ra's, he would regain his strength and immediately kill his daughter, proving that his malice was as immortal as his body. If you chose to let him die, he would look at Batman with a strange sense of respect, acknowledging that his detective had finally outplayed him. It was a fascinating interrogation of Batman's morality, asking if some people are so dangerous that letting them live is a greater sin than letting them die. Then there was the return of the Mad Hatter in Wonderland, which took the series back into the realm of the surreal. Jervis Tetch had managed to capture several police officers and was forcing them into a twisted reenactment of Alice in Wonderland within the walls of the GCPD. The mission involved a psychological interrogation that eventually pulled Batman into a literal pop-up book world. This was one of the most creative uses of the engine's visual capabilities. The environment was made of cardboard and paper, with the buildings and characters folding and unfolding as you moved through the pages. It was a recap of the entire trilogy, showing the asylum, the city, and finally the Knight, all from the perspective of a fairy tale. The battle against the Hatter's henchmen in this stylized world was a colorful, chaotic distraction that provided a stark contrast to the gritty rain of the city outside. It showed that Rocksteady wasn't afraid to embrace the weirdness of the comic book's source material, even in their most serious entry. The final piece of the Season of Infamy was Beneath the Surface, which brought back Killer Croc in a form that was truly monstrous. His mutation had accelerated, turning him into a massive, hulking beast that looked more like a prehistoric reptile than a man. The mission took place on the ruins of the Iron Heights prison airship, which had crashed into the harbor. The environment was a nightmare of twisted metal and flooded corridors filled with the sounds of the beast moving in the shadows. The Predator sequences here were incredibly tense, as you had to navigate the wreckage while avoiding Croc's patrols. The boss fight at the end required you to coordinate with Nightwing, using the dual play mechanic to distract the creature while you used your gadgets to disable his life support systems. It was a brutal physical confrontation that felt like a true heavyweight fight. The tragedy of the mission was the revelation that Croc's mutation was being caused by the experiments of the prison's warden, a reminder that the monsters of Gotham are often created by the cruelty of the people in power. Beyond the Season of Infamy, the additional story packs allowed players to step into the boots of other members of the Bat family, providing different perspectives on the Knight's events. The Red Hood story pack was particularly interesting, as it showed Jason Todd's transition into a lethal vigilante. The gameplay for Red Hood was significantly more aggressive than Batman's. He used dual pistols and was not afraid to use lethal force, creating a much more visceral and violent combat style. His takedowns were fast and brutal, reflecting his anger and his desire for permanent solutions to crime. The Harley Quinn story pack, which we have discussed, gave us a look at her warped perspective through the psychosis mode, but it also showed the level of planning and devotion she had for her Mr. J. Even without the Joker, she was a formidable threat, using her agility and her massive hammer to tear through the police department in Blüdhaven. The Batgirl, A Matter of Family DLC was perhaps the most substantial of these additions. Developed by WB Games Montreal, it served as a prequel to the entire trilogy, showing Barbara Gordon in her prime as Batgirl. The setting, a derelict amusement park on the water, was a masterpiece of environmental design. It was filled with the kind of creepy carnival atmosphere that the Joker loves, but it also felt like a functioning piece of history. The focus on hacking was a key part of the gameplay, reflecting Barbara's technical expertise. You could use her remote hacking tool to activate various park attractions, spinning rides, light shows, even gas traps, to take down thugs in creative ways. This added a layer of environmental interaction that was unique to her character, making the Predator encounters feel fresh and different. The final fight against the Joker and Harley Quinn was a chaotic brawl that required you to coordinate with Robin, providing a glimpse of the partnership that would eventually define the future of the series. In the main game, the Heir to the Cowl mission featuring Azrael was another narrative highlight that touched on the theme of destiny. Throughout the story, Azrael appears on various rooftops, leaving strange flaming symbols for you to find. Each encounter is a trial, forcing you to fight a group of enemies as Azrael without taking a single hit. This was a direct test of the player's mastery over the combat system, as the rhythmic counters and timing were essential for success. Azrael's fighting style was a mirror of Batman's, but with a more aggressive, knight-like flair. The conclusion of the mission involved a psychological battle within Azrael's own mind, as he had to decide whether to follow the orders of the Order of St. Dumas and kill Batman, or break free of his programming and forge his own path. It was another instance where the game presented the player with a meaningful choice, allowing you to decide the fate of a character based on your own sense of justice. The Riddler's presence in the final game was more pervasive than ever, and his challenges were a testament to the studio's love for logic and spatial puzzles. While some complained about the sheer number of trophies, all 243 of them, the way they were hidden was often incredibly clever. Some required you to use the Batmobile's winch to manipulate massive machinery, while others required the use of the voice synthesizer to trick a robot into walking onto a pressure plate. These weren't just simple find the item tasks. They were mini-games that utilized every single mechanic in Batman's arsenal. The orphanage where he held Catwoman was the center of these games, featuring a series of rooms that were designed to be solved through cooperation. The back and forth between Batman and Catwoman during these puzzles added a human element to the mechanical challenges, reminding the player of why they were doing this in the first place, not just for the trophies, but to save a friend. The final boss fight against the Riddler was a massive multi-stage encounter that combined tank combat, rhythmic brawling, and cooperative takedowns. Seeing the Riddler emerge in his giant mechanical spider suit was a moment of pure comic book spectacle. It was the ultimate expression of his ego. He couldn't just be smarter than Batman, he had to be physically more powerful too. But like all of his plans, his own pride was his undoing. By overcomplicating the fight, he gave Batman and Catwoman the openings they needed to dismantle his machine. When you finally hauled him to the GCPD, he was a broken man, ranting and raving about how the detective must have cheated. It was a perfect ending for a character who had spent 3 games being the most persistent and annoying presence in the city. The Joker hallucinations were perhaps the most brilliant part of the final entry's narrative structure. We have discussed how he would appear randomly, but some of the specific instances are worth detailing for their sheer creativity. There is a moment when you are gliding through the city and you see a massive statue of the Batman on top of a building. As you approach, the face of the statue slowly shifts, the stoic jaw turning into a wide, toothy grin. If you land on the shoulder of the statue and look closely, the entire material changes from cold stone to painted porcelain. These dynamic, real-time transformations were happening all over the city. You might be in a combat encounter and notice that one of the thugs has suddenly turned into the Joker, wielding a knife and laughing as he tries to stab you. If you counter him, the image flickers and returns to a normal henchman. This kept the player in a state of constant unease, never knowing what was real and what was a symptom of the infection. The fake death screens were another way the developers messed with the player. Normally, when you die in the game, a villain appears on screen to taunt you, but in the final chapter, the Joker would occasionally hijack these screens. You would see him in various behind-the-scenes poses, sitting in the director's chair holding a clapperboard, or even doing a puppet show with a Batman doll. Sometimes he would offer legitimate advice on how to win the fight, only to finish the sentence with a punchline about how he can't wait to see you die again. It was a way to make the failure of the player feel like a part of the narrative, further blurring the line between the game and the story. The final, legendary sequence where the Joker takes over the first-person perspective, forcing the player to experience his own warped reality, was a chilling and unforgettable way to conclude the rivalry. You were no longer playing as the hero, you were seeing the world through the eyes of the monster, and it was a terrifyingly colorful place. The GCPD was the living record of these events, and as we have noted, it was filled with secrets. The Aaron Cash recordings in the evidence locker provided a comprehensive history of the entire trilogy. Listening to him talk about the first night at the asylum, the madness of the city, and the final war for the night gave the series a sense of chronological weight. You could see the physical evolution of the technology, from the primitive grappling hooks of the early years to the high-tech liquid metal armor of the finale. The evidence locker also featured items that referenced the wider DC world, like a shard of green crystal that hinted at the existence of Superman, or a broken bow that suggested the presence of the Green Arrow. These weren't just fan service, they were world-building tools that made Gotham feel like it was part of a living, breathing universe. The Wayne Tower itself was a masterpiece of vertical design and served as the hub for your interactions with Lucius Fox. Lucius was the man behind the machine, the one who provided the upgrades for the Batmobile and the suit. His office was filled with high-tech prototypes and sleek, modern furniture, providing a sharp contrast to the gothic decay of the rest of the city. The voicemails on Bruce's desk, which we have mentioned, were a source of endless speculation for the fans. Hearing messages from characters like Lex Luthor or Vicky Vale added a layer of daily life to the superhero drama. It reminded the player that while Bruce Wayne might spend his nights as a bat, during the day he is a billionaire businessman who has to deal with corporate takeovers and media scandals. This duality was at the heart of the character, and the game handled it with a level of sophistication that was truly impressive. The Nightfall Protocol, the final cinematic of the trilogy, was the culmination of all these threads. To unlock it, the player had to truly master the game, capturing every single villain and completing every single challenge. This was a monumental task that required a deep understanding of the combat, the Predator's stealth, and the driving mechanics. For those who achieved it, the ending provided a sense of closure that was both epic and bittersweet. The destruction of Wayne Manor and the apparent death of Batman was a bold move that forced the player to confront the reality that the mission had a cost. The final shot of a shadowy, monstrous Batman using fear toxin to terrify muggers in a dark alley was a perfect full circle moment. It suggested that Batman had finally achieved his goal. He was no longer a man who could be killed. He had become a myth that would haunt the criminals of Gotham forever. The technical choices made for the finale, particularly the reliance on real-time rendering for all cinematics, was a masterstroke of immersion. It meant that every battle damage on the suit, every drop of rain on the cape, and every aesthetic choice made by the player was visible in every single story beat. This level of continuity is rare in games, and it served to ground the player in the world. When Batman had his final, unmasked conversation with Commissioner Gordon, seeing the wear and tear of the long night on his face was a powerful visual reminder of the stakes. The animation blending was so smooth that the transitions from gameplay to cutscene were nearly invisible, creating a cinematic flow that felt like one continuous experience. It was the realization of the dream that started with a simple rhythm game prototype, a seamless, interactive symphony of motion and storytelling. As we look at the legacy of the final game, we have to acknowledge the passion of the community that kept the secrets alive for so long. Even years after release, players were still finding new hallucination triggers or hidden radio messages. The Arkham Knight himself, despite the polarizing reaction to his identity, remains a visually stunning and tactically challenging antagonist who provided a unique anti-Batman experience. The Batmobile, for all the debate it sparked, was an incredible piece of mechanical design that added a whole new dimension to the city's traversal. And through it all, the rhythmic heart of the series, the timing, the counters, the flow, remained the foundation upon which everything else was built. The journey of the Arkham Trilogy was a story of a studio that wasn't afraid to take risks. They took a legendary character and weren't afraid to break him. They took a simple combat system and expanded it into a sprawling psychological war. They took a gothic asylum and expanded it into a neon-lit urban jungle. And in the end, they gave us a definitive ending for a hero who has meant so much to so many. Every secret we find, every riddle we solve, and every time we jump off the top of Wayne Tower into the rainy night, we are participating in a masterpiece of game design. It was a project born of obsession, and that obsession is what made us all feel, if only for a few nights, like we were the one behind the mask. The atmosphere of the three islands also played a massive role in the storytelling. Bleak Island, with its heavy Gothic influence and the massive GCPD headquarters, felt like the old, battle-scarred heart of Gotham. Miagani Island, with its vibrant neon and towering skyscrapers, represented the ambition and wealth of the city's elite. Founders Island, with its unfinished construction sites and ultra-modern architecture, felt like a city that was trying to rebuild itself while still haunted by its past. This variety ensured that the city never felt repetitive, even as you spent dozens of hours exploring its streets. The way the militia would slowly occupy different areas, setting up checkpoints and watchtowers, created a dynamic sense of a city under siege. You could physically see the occupation spreading, and then physically see the liberation as you dismantled their defenses piece by piece. The New Game Plus mode also offered a fresh challenge for the veterans. By removing the counter indicators above enemies' heads, the game forced you to rely entirely on the rhythmic timing and the visual cues of the animations. This brought the experience even closer to that original rhythm game concept, where you had to feel the beat of the fight rather than just reacting to prompts. It was the ultimate test of the combat system's depth, proving that the underlying logic was robust enough to stand on its own without the help of modern HUD elements. For many players, this was the way the game was meant to be played, a raw, visceral experience where one mistake could end the fight. The Season of Infamy missions in particular benefited from this increased difficulty. Taking on the Shadow Assassins without the help of indicators was a heart-pounding experience that required perfect focus. Each strike, each parry, and each use of a gadget had to be perfectly timed. It turned the combat into a high-stakes dance of blades and shadows, a fitting way to conclude the series. The rewards for these missions, including the unique items for the evidence locker and the deep tissue scans for the lore files, provided a sense of accomplishment that went beyond just finishing the story. You were completing the history of the Arkhamverse piece by piece until the final page was turned. Looking back on the thousands of individual details that made up the Arkham saga, it is impossible not to feel a sense of awe at the craftsmanship on display. From the way the rain pools in the gutters of a Gotham alley to the way the Joker's voice echoes in Batman's mind during a quiet moment of reflection, everything was designed with a purpose. Rocksteady didn't just make a superhero game, they built a world that felt as heavy and real as the character who protected it. They took a rhythmic seed and grew it into a towering achievement of the medium, a trilogy that will be remembered long after the lights go out on the final night. Every secret found, every villain caught, and every time we soar through the rainy skyline is a tribute to the team that made us all believe that a man can truly become a myth. The level of technical detail in the city's destruction was also a major point of pride for the studio. When the Batmobile crashed through a stone wall or a metal gate, the debris was calculated using a sophisticated physics script that allowed for thousands of individual pieces to react to the impact. This meant that no two collisions ever looked the same. The dust clouds, the flying bricks, and the way the metal would bend and tear all added to the feeling of raw, unbridled power. It transformed the environment from a static backdrop into a reactive, destructible playground. This was particularly effective during the high-speed chases, where the city itself would become a weapon, with crumbling structures and exploding scenery creating a chaotic obstacle course for the player to navigate. Even the way the Fear multi-takedown was visualized showed a deep understanding of the character. The slow motion effect wasn't just for style, it was a representation of Batman's tactical focus, the way he perceives a room and plans his strikes in a fraction of a second. The way the camera would snap between targets, focusing on the points of impact, made the sequence feel incredibly visceral. You could see the fear on the thugs' faces, the way their bodies reacted to the force of the strikes, and the grace of Batman's movements as he moved between them. It was a visual symphony of violence that perfectly captured the essence of the character as a master of martial arts and intimidation. The sound of the final game was also a masterpiece of non-static audio. The music would change dynamically based on the state of the city, becoming more frantic during combat, more somber during the cloudburst phase, and more triumphant as you liberated each district. The ambient sounds were also incredibly detailed. If you stood on a rooftop in Miagani, you could hear the distant humming of the neon signs and the muffled sound of music from the clubs below. If you were in the underground tunnels of Founders Island, the audio would become echoing and claustrophobic, with the sound of dripping water and distant machinery creating a sense of unease. This layer of audio polish was essential for the immersion, ensuring that the player felt like they were in a physical space that had its own unique soundscape. The journey from the asylum to the night was a story of a studio that grew alongside their hero. They learned how to build bigger, better, and more complex worlds without losing the heart of what made the character special. They took a simple idea about rhythm and timing and turned it into the definitive version of the Dark Knight for millions of people. And as we look at the final shadowy figure in the Nightfall ending, we can be certain that while the trilogy may be over, the legend of the Arkhamverse is something that will haunt the industry for years to hour. It was a project born of a love for the source material, a dedication to technical excellence, and a desire to give the fans an experience they would never forget. The development of the Batsuit itself was another legendary effort. In the final entry, the suit was not a single piece of equipment, but a complex assembly of over 100 individual pieces. Each piece had its own material properties, meaning that the way light reflected off the metal plating was different from the way it reflected off the carbon fiber or the heavy fabric of the cape. This was handled by a sophisticated shader script that allowed the suit to look realistic in every lighting condition. As the night progressed, the suit would accumulate damage, scrapes from bullets, tears in the fabric, and dirt from the city streets. This visible wear and tear served as a chronological record of your struggles, making the final unmasking scene even more powerful, as you could see exactly what the man inside the suit had endured to save his city. In many ways, the final game was a reflection of the studio's own history. They had started with a small, focused project and ended with a global phenomenon. They had faced technical challenges, creative debates, and the weight of immense fan expectations, but they had never wavered in their commitment to the character. The Arkham Trilogy remains a benchmark for what can be achieved when a studio is given the freedom to fully explore a legendary property. It was a masterclass in atmosphere, a celebration of history, and a journey that took us all into the heart of the night. Every secret we find, every riddle we solve, and every time we dive into the rainy Gotham skyline is a part of that legacy, a dance of shadows that will never truly end. As we reach the final horizon of this sprawling journey through the Arkhamverse, it becomes clear that the legacy of Rocksteady's trilogy is not just found in the games themselves, but in the way they transformed an entire industry's approach to the superhero genre. When you stand on the highest spire of Wayne Tower in the final hours of the night, looking out over the rain-swept islands of Gotham, you aren't just looking at a digital map. You are looking at the culmination of a decade of obsession, a massive technical and creative effort that redefined what it means to be a hero in a virtual space. The sheer density of the world in the final entry was a benchmark that many other studios are still trying to reach. Every flickering neon sign, every steam-venting manhole cover, and every gargoyle perched over a dark alley was placed with a specific purpose. The city was designed to be a living record of its own history, a place where the shadows are thick with memories of the asylum and the madness of the city-wide prison. One of the most fascinating aspects of the post-game experience in the final chapter is how the city continues to react to the player even after the main story has been concluded. If you have achieved the true ending and activated the Nightfall Protocol, the streets of Gotham take on a different atmosphere. The militia presence is largely dismantled, but the lingering most wanted villains continue to haunt the corners of the map. The dialogue among the remaining thugs shifts from a focus on the war to a fearful speculation about what happened to the Batman. You can hear them whispering in the alleys about the explosion at Wayne Manor, wondering if the Dark Knight is truly gone or if he has become something even more terrifying. This persistent world logic is one of the hallmarks of the series. The developers never wanted the credits to feel like a hard stop. Instead, they wanted the legend to linger, encouraging the player to keep exploring until every last secret had been unearthed. The technical mastery of the Fear multi-takedown system is something that deserves a deeper look as we reflect on the evolution of the combat. This mechanic was the perfect evolution of that original rhythmic heart we discussed in the very beginning. It required a specific type of mental focus, a way of perceiving the environment that mirrored Batman's own tactical mind. When the game slows down into that crystalline high-definition focus, it isn't just for style. It allows the player to calculate their next move with the same precision as the world's greatest detective. The animation blending during these sequences was incredibly complex, as the engine had to account for the relative positions of up to 5 different enemies, the terrain they were standing on, and the specific obstacles in the room. If an enemy was standing near a table, the takedown animation would change to incorporate that object. If they were near a wall, Batman would use it to his advantage. This level of environmental reactivity meant that no two fear takedowns ever looked exactly the same, providing a constant sense of cinematic novelty. The Batmobile's physics, which were so central to the final experience, were also a masterclass in non-standard vehicle logic. Most games with driving mechanics rely on a traditional four-wheel simulation, but the Batmobile was a hybrid beast. In battle mode, the vehicle essentially functioned like a character on a 360-degree axis, allowing for strafing movements that were more akin to a third-person shooter than a racing game. The programming required to make this transition feel natural was immense. The developers had to create a custom physics set that governed how the car interacted with the ground while in this transformed state. They used a sophisticated suspension script that allowed the vehicle to absorb the shock of landing from massive jumps while still feeling heavy and grounded during combat. The sound of the hydraulic arms extending and the heavy metal plates shifting into position was a tactile reward for the player, making the machine feel like a physical extension of Batman's own will. Speaking of the car, we must also mention the incredible detail found in the Riddler's underground racetracks. These weren't just simple loops, they were massive mechanical traps that required the player to manipulate the environment in real time. Using the B trigger to move walls, ramps, and obstacles in sync with your high-speed maneuvers was a thrilling test of coordination. It turned the Batmobile into a puzzle-solving tool, a concept that was further explored in the various underground tunnel puzzles scattered throughout the city. The way the Riddler would taunt you over the radio during these segments added a layer of psychological pressure, turning a technical challenge into a personal rivalry. Even after you defeated him, you could return to these tracks to beat your own times, with the global leaderboards providing a sense of community for the most dedicated drivers. The Season of Infamy expansion, as we have noted, provided a fitting farewell for many iconic villains, but the way it integrated into the main game was particularly clever. You didn't have to launch it from a separate menu. The missions appeared organically on your most wanted wheel, allowing you to tackle them alongside the main campaign. The return of the Mad Hatter, Jervis Tetch, in the Wonderland mission was a visual standout. The pop-up book world was a masterpiece of stylized art direction, with the paper textures of the asylum and the city looking like they had been hand-drawn by a madman. It was a beautiful way to revisit the history of the trilogy, showing how the events of the earlier games had become a part of the city's folklore. The final confrontation, where the Hatter tries to force Batman into his own warped story, was a powerful exploration of the theme of control, something that both the hero and the villain have struggled with throughout the series. The moral weight of the choices in the Shadow War mission involving Ra's al Ghul remains one of the most discussed topics in the community. By giving the player the power to decide whether the ancient leader lives or dies, Rocksteady was asking the player to truly inhabit the mind of the Batman. There was no right answer. Both choices had dark consequences. If you followed the mercy path, you were effectively ending a cycle of immortality and violence that had lasted for centuries, but you were also breaking the core tenet of Batman's mission. If you chose the healing path, you were preserving the life of a monster at the cost of his daughter's life. It was a sophisticated piece of narrative design that didn't provide a tidy resolution, leaving the player to live with the weight of their decision. This kind of moral ambiguity was a key part of what made the final chapter feel more mature and complex than your standard superhero adventure. The Killer Croc mission in Beneath the Surface was another example of how the series evolved its visual storytelling. The mutation of Waylon Jones was handled with a level of graphic detail that was truly unsettling. You could see the way his skin had hardened into thick reptilian scales, and the way his eyes had become cold and inhuman. The environment of the crashed Iron Heights airship was a masterpiece of atmospheric dread, with the sounds of the swamp and the creaking of the metal structure creating a constant sense of unease. The mission also touched on the theme of corruption, showing how the warden's illegal experiments had transformed a man into a true monster. It was a grisly, tragic story that reminded the player that Gotham is a city where the powerful often prey on the weak, creating the very demons that Batman has to fight. The GCPD Evidence Locker, which we have discussed as a digital museum, also served as a repository for the various lore entries that you could unlock by solving Riddler challenges. Each entry provided a deep dive into the history of a specific character or location, filled with unique artwork and non-static text that added layers of depth to the world. You could read about the founding of the asylum, the rise of the mob families, and the secrets of the various most wanted villains. These entries weren't just filler, they were essential for understanding the vast, interconnected nature of the Arkhamverse. They showed the level of research and passion that the writers had for the source material, ensuring that every fan, whether they were a newcomer or a lifelong comic reader, could find something to appreciate. The Joker hallucinations continued to provide some of the most memorable moments in the final hours of the night. There is a specific secret that many players missed. If you return to the movie studios after a certain point in the story, you can find the Joker sitting in the director's chair in one of the sound stages. He will deliver a long, rambling monologue about the nature of heroics and the inevitability of Batman's fall. It is a brilliant piece of writing that perfectly captures the toxic intimacy of their relationship. The way he would appear in the background of almost every major cutscene, sometimes replacing other characters entirely during a flash of fear toxin-induced madness, was a technical and creative triumph. It required the developers to essentially record and animate two different versions of many scenes, ensuring that the Joker's presence felt integrated rather than tacked on. The technical polish of the dual play system reached a peak during the final Most Wanted missions. Fighting alongside Robin to take down the remnants of the militia was a high-octane experience that showcased the fluidity of the animation blending. You could see the contrast between Batman's heavy, brutal strikes and Robin's faster, more acrobatic style. The way the two characters would coordinate their movements, one launching an enemy into the air for the other to catch, was a joy to watch and play. It emphasized the theme of the Bat family as a unified force, showing that while Batman may have started his war alone, he had inspired a generation of heroes to carry on the fight. This sense of legacy was at the heart of the true ending, providing a hopeful counterpoint to the darkness of the Nightfall Protocol. The sound of the final game was also a masterpiece of interactive audio design. The music didn't just loop, it reacted to the player's actions in real time. If you were in a high-speed chase, the orchestral arrangements would become more frantic and percussion-heavy. If you entered a quiet, stealthy area, the score would shift into a minimalist, tension-filled string arrangement. The ambient sounds of the city were equally dynamic. You could hear the distant echoes of the militia's sirens, the rhythmic splashing of the rain, and the humming of the high-tech equipment in the clock tower. This layer of audio immersion was essential for making Gotham feel like a physical, three-dimensional space. The team used a sophisticated propagation script to ensure that sounds would bounce realistically off the buildings and through the alleyways, creating a rich, immersive soundscape that made you feel like you were truly there. One of the most heartwarming secrets in the entire series is found in the final entry's photo mode. If you take a high-resolution screenshot of Batman's eyes, you can see the reflection of the Gotham skyline in his pupils. This is a level of detail that most players would never even notice, but it serves as a testament to the obsession of the artists at Rocksteady. They didn't just build a world for the player to look at, they built a world that was reflected in the very soul of the protagonist. Similarly, the way the rain-slicked surfaces of the city would reflect the neon signs and the searchlights was handled with a sophisticated real-time reflection script that allowed the environment to feel vibrant and alive, even in the middle of a choking fog of fear. The legacy of the free-flow combat system cannot be overstated. It was a revolutionary approach to action gaming that prioritized rhythm, timing, and environmental awareness over mindless button mashing. By removing the counter indicators in New Game Plus, the developers forced the player to rely on the visual grammar of the animations themselves. You had to look at the way a thug would wind up for a punch, or the way a ninja would shift their weight before a strike. This created a much more visceral and intimate combat experience, where every move was a conscious choice. It was the ultimate realization of the Batman simulator dream, a way for the player to feel like a master of martial arts through their own skill and focus. As we look back on the journey from that first rhythmic prototype at the Asylum to the final world-shaking conclusion over Gotham, the impact of the Arkham Trilogy on the industry is undeniable. It set a new standard for how licensed properties could be handled, proving that a superhero game could be a serious, mature piece of art. The Predator stealth mechanics redefined how developers approach tactical encounters, and the seamless, no-loading world building became a benchmark for modern open-world design. But more than the technical innovations, it was the love for the character that stood out. Rocksteady didn't just give us a game, they gave us a chance to inhabit a myth. Every secret hidden in a rainy alley, every riddle solved on a windswept rooftop, and every whispered conversation between thugs on the street was a part of a larger epic tapestry. The developers understood that Batman is not just a man in a suit. He is a symbol of justice, a master of fear, and a detective of the human soul. By building a world that reacted to our every move, they created a level of immersion that was truly unprecedented. We didn't just play through a story, we became a part of a legend that has inspired millions for nearly a century. One of the most persistent and fascinating aspects of the trilogy's conclusion is the mystery of the final scene. For years, fans have debated whether the nightmare figure in the alleyway was Bruce Wayne using a refined version of the fear toxin, or if it was a new hero taking up the mantle. Rocksteady has remained deliberately quiet on the matter, allowing the community to find their own meaning in the resolution. It was a perfect way to end the saga, not with a tidy bow, but with a question that keeps the legend alive. It reminds us that even when the man is gone, the symbol remains, a shadow watching over the city, ready to strike from the darkness. The Arkham Insider videos, which we have mentioned, provided a glimpse into the thousands of individual decisions that led to this final masterpiece. They talked about the fear takedown as a way to empower the player, the Batmobile as a way to escalate the stakes, and the Joker hallucinations as a way to interrogate the hero's psyche. It was a journey of passion and obsession, a story of a studio that wasn't afraid to push the boundaries of what was possible. They took a rhythmic seed and grew it into a towering achievement of the medium, a trilogy that will be studied and enjoyed for decades to our. As we conclude this deep dive into the secrets and the technical brilliance of the Arkhamverse, we are reminded of the power of detail, the swaying of a cape, the flicker of a neon sign, the rhythmic clicking of a grapple hook, and the silent shadow on a gargoyle. These are the things that make a world feel real. Rocksteady didn't just build a game, they built a legacy. They took us into the heart of the night and showed us that even in the deepest darkness, there is always a light for those who have the courage to fight for it. Every secret found, every villain caught, and every time we soar through the rainy Gotham skyline is a part of that legacy, a dance of shadows that will stay with us forever. The impact of the series also extended to the way other games approached the concept of identity. In the final chapter, the reveal of the Arkham Knight as Jason Todd was a moment that forced the player to confront the history of the character in a way that felt personal. It wasn't just a plot twist, it was a consequence of the actions we had witnessed throughout the trilogy. The physical representation of this history was found in the Panessa Studios, where the records of Jason's torment were displayed for the player to see. It was a grisly, emotional sequence that grounded the superhero drama in a very human tragedy. This level of narrative consequence is something that few games achieve, and it is a testament to the strength of the writing team. Even the way the most wanted missions were handled after the main story showed a level of care that is rare in the industry. Instead of just resetting the world, the game acknowledged the state of the city. The militia had lost their commander, the villains were losing their grip, and the citizens were starting to reclaim their streets. See, Seeing the GCPD officers out in the world dismantling the remains of the occupation gave the player a sense of lasting impact. You weren't just clearing boxes, you were actually saving a city. The final arrests of characters like the Penguin or Two-Face were filled with unique dialogue that referenced the entire trilogy, providing a sense of closure that felt earned. The true ending, the Nightfall Protocol, remains the ultimate reward for the most dedicated fans. It required a level of mastery that few players achieve, solving every riddle, finding every trophy, and capturing every criminal. It was a monumental task that served as a final test of the player's devotion to the world. And as the final cinematic played out, showing the destruction of the old life and the birth of the new myth, the silence was a powerful closing note. We had seen the man fall, the legend rise, and the city survive. It was the perfect end for a series that has meant so much to so many. As we look toward the future, the influence of the Arkham series can be seen in almost every major action game that has followed. From the fluid combat of the Spider-Man games to the tactical stealth of Mad Max, the DNA of Rocksteady's work is everywhere. But more than the mechanics, it is the philosophy of immersion through detail that has left the biggest mark. They proved that if you build a world with enough care and passion, the players will lose themselves in it. They proved that a superhero game can be a deep, psychological, and adult experience. They proved that even a man in a bat suit can tell a story that touches on the most fundamental aspects of the human condition. The rhythmic combat, the predator stealth, the seamless world building, and the obsessive attention to lore. These are the pillars upon which the Arkhamverse was built. It was a decade of work that resulted in a masterpiece of the medium, a trilogy that will be remembered as a high watermark for digital storytelling. We have all been lucky to be along for the ride, to glide through those rainy streets and face the darkness alongside the Caped Crusader. And as we finally step back into the light, we carry with us the memories of a world where nothing was ever quite what it seemed, and the most important stories were always the ones told in the shadows. In the final reflections on this series, one cannot help but think of the thousands of people who worked on it. From the concept artists who drew the first sketches of the Titan Joker to the programmers who spent 2 years perfecting the physics of the cape, it was a collective effort of immense scale. They didn't just make a product, they made a tribute to a character who has represented justice for nearly a century, and a tribute to the fans who have followed his story through every comic, every movie, and every game. The Arkham Saga was their gift to us, a chance to truly be the Batman, and it is a gift that will keep on giving for as long as there are shadows in Gotham. Every secret hidden in the radio waves, every hidden room behind a wall in the warden's office, and every rhythmic counter performed in the heat of a brawl was a part of that gift. We have uncovered the mysteries of the asylum, the chaos of the city, and the final war for the night, and through it all, we have seen the power of a clear vision. Rocksteady knew exactly what they wanted their Batman to be, and they never wavered from that path. They took us into the heart of the night and showed us that even when the man is gone, the legend remains. It is a dance of shadows, a symphony of motion, and a masterpiece of storytelling that will stay with us forever. The final hour of the night brought with it a sense of quiet triumph. As the first light of dawn began to touch the rooftops of the GCPD, and the last of the most wanted villains were safely behind bars, the player could finally take a moment to look out over the city. It was a city that was scarred, broken, and changed forever, but it was also a city that was finally free. The journey that started with a simple rhythm game prototype had come to an end, and as the screen faded to black for the final time, the legacy of the Arkhamverse was secure. It was a masterclass in game design, a love letter to a legend, and a journey that we will never forget. From the rhythmic heart to the final shadow, it was and always will be the definitive Batman experience. The evolution of the most wanted missions in the final chapter also served to flesh out the world in unexpected ways. One of the most interesting additions was the perfect crime mystery, which felt like a true detective story. You had to follow a series of grisly clues, mutilated bodies displayed as art across the city, to track down Professor Pig. This mission didn't rely on combat or gadgets as much as it relied on observation and deduction. You had to use the deep tissue scanner to find unique markers on each victim, such as a surgical implant or a hidden scar, to identify who they were and why they were targeted. It was a stark departure from the explosive action of the main campaign, reminding the player that, at his core, Batman is still a detective. The final confrontation in Pike's surgery was a masterclass in body horror and unsettling atmosphere, providing a dark counterpoint to the more traditional superhero antics of the other villains. Similarly, the Firefly missions took advantage of the new Batmobile mechanics, creating high-speed chases that felt like something out of a blockbuster movie. Chasing the pyromaniac through the streets of Gotham while he rained fire down on your vehicle was a thrilling test of your driving skills. It wasn't just about speed, it was about avoiding obstacles and managing your thrusters to close the gap before he could escape. These missions provided a much-needed variety to the gameplay loop, ensuring that every time you sat down to play, you were doing something different. Whether you were dismantling a militia checkpoint, defusing a bomb in the middle of a street brawl, or tracking an invisible threat through the sewers, the game was constantly throwing new challenges your way. The Man-Bat quest, as we have mentioned, provided one of the greatest jump scares in gaming history, but it also told a tragic story about the dangers of scientific obsession. Tracking Kirk Langstrom through the skies of Gotham was a unique challenge that required you to use the audio tracking system to find him by the sound of his screeching. When you finally managed to tackle him mid-air and administer the cure, the transformation back into human form was handled with a level of graphic detail that was truly impressive. Seeing the broken man inside the monster added a layer of human cost to the chaos of the night. It was another example of how Rocksteady was able to take even the most comic book of characters and ground them in a reality that felt heavy and meaningful. Even the Riddler's final boss fight was a grand departure from the earlier games. Instead of just walking into a room and punching him, you had to fight a giant mechanical spider bot while coordinating with Catwoman. This fight required you to use every skill you had learned throughout the game, switching between characters, using specific gadgets to disable the bot's shields, and timing your attacks to avoid the deadly laser sweeps. It was a fittingly over-the-top conclusion for a character whose ego was his greatest weakness. When you finally hauled him away to the GCPD, his frantic excuses and desperate attempts to prove his superior intellect were a perfect closing note for one of the most persistent and annoying thorns in Batman's side. As the night drew to a close and the first light of dawn began to touch the skyline, the city of Gotham felt different. It was battered, broken, and scarred by the war, but it was still standing. The feeling of reaching 100% completion and seeing the Nightfall Protocol for the first time was a moment of profound accomplishment. It was the end of a long, dark journey, and as the screen faded to black, the silence was earned. We had seen the hero fall, the legend rise, and the city survive. It was a perfect closing note for a trilogy that had given us everything it had. And as we look back on the 1,000 of hours spent in that world, we are reminded that some stories don't just end, they become a part of us. The Arkham Saga was one of those stories, a dance of shadows that will stay with us forever. The final hours of the Arkham Saga were not just a conclusion to a story, but a celebration of a decade of artistic growth. Every secret, every hidden message, and every subtle environmental detail was a testament to the fact that Rocksteady didn't just want to make a game, they wanted to create a myth. The technical brilliance of the seamless world, the rhythmic perfection of the combat, and the narrative depth of the psychological war for Batman's soul all came together to create an experience that was truly unique. As we leave the rain-slicked streets of Gotham and the flickering neon lights behind, we carry with us the realization that the Arkham Trilogy was more than just a series of games. It was a masterclass in how to treat a legendary character with respect while still pushing the boundaries of what a video game could be. It was a journey into the heart of the night, and it is a journey that will inspire generations of players and developers to hour. The shadow of the Bat remains, a silent guardian over the world of gaming, reminding us all that even in the deepest darkness, there is always hope for those who have the courage to stand up and fight.